On a freezing morning in the last week of 1849, a man is marched into a public square in St. Petersburg and lined up in the snow to be shot. He is 28 years old, and only a few moments ago he was told he has minutes left to live. His name is Fyodor Dostoevsky, and on this morning almost everything his name now stands for is still unwritten, still locked inside the thin figure shivering at the edge of the square. He has spent the past 8 months in a fortress cell, arrested for belonging to a circle of young men who read forbidden books and talked in low voices about a freer Russia. Now the sentence is read aloud across the ranks of soldiers. A priest comes forward with a cross, and some of the condemned bend to kiss it. An officer breaks a sword over the head of each of the noblemen among them, the old ceremony for a man being stripped of his life before it is taken from him. Then the first 3 are walked to wooden posts set in the ground, bound to them, and have white caps pulled down over their faces. Dostoevsky stands in the second group, a few steps back, which means he is watching all of it and counting, with perhaps a minute of his own remaining. The order goes down the line. The soldiers raise their rifles and take aim at the 3 men against the posts, and then nothing happens. A drum begins to beat the retreat. The rifles come down. A carriage has stopped at the edge of the square, and an officer is reading out a fresh order. The Tsar, in his mercy, has spared their lives and sends them to hard labor in Siberia in place of the firing squad. The 3 men are untied from the posts. Only later does the real shape of the morning come clear, that there had been no last-second change of heart at all, that the reprieve had been arranged from the very start, and that the order had come down from the Tsar himself to carry the entire ceremony of death all the way to its final second before the prisoners were allowed to know. The terror itself was the sentence, staged breath by breath, on purpose. One of the men who had stood bound to a post that morning, a young officer named Grigoriev, never found his way back to his own mind and lived out the rest of his years with his reason broken in half. Dostoevsky walked out of that square and lived another 31 years, and into them he poured a body of work that did something no one had quite managed before. It went down into a single human soul and kept going, past the floor of it, into the cellars where we keep the things we will not say to ourselves in daylight. He put an axe in the hands of a gentle, half-starved student and made you feel the awful logic of it from the inside. He set one brother to handing God back his ticket to a world built on the suffering of children, and was never afterward quite sure the brother was wrong. He is called a novelist, which is true, and far too small a word for the room it has to hold. What that morning at the posts seems to have left behind in him was a question, and he turned it over for the rest of his life. What is a life worth once you have stood at the very edge of losing it and had it handed back? How far is a person free to go? And is there anything in the end that holds them? He pressed it down into the hardest shape it can take, the one lying underneath nearly everything he wrote. If there is no God and nothing at all waiting on the far side of death, then is everything permitted? Tonight, there is the whole of it. Everything this restless, divided mind managed to work out across a life of cells and seizures and ruin and love, and the one question at its center that he could never, finally, lay to rest. None of which you have to hold tightly just now. It is late wherever you are. The day is already behind you, the room is dark, and there is nothing in any of this that has to be settled before morning. That is the quiet mercy of the hour. The questions that lie so heavily on the chest at noon turn out to weigh almost nothing here in the dark, where no one is asking you to decide a single thing and there is nowhere else you need to be. So let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding the day, and let the jaw loosen with them. Nothing about this needs to be rushed. There are a few long hours in front of us, and we can move through them as slowly as you like. If this is the kind of company worth keeping at such an hour, one mind, followed all the way through in a voice kept low for the dark, then a quiet tap on subscribe helps it find the next person lying awake somewhere tonight. And here is something to hold as you settle, with no need to reach the answer before sleep. Has there ever been a moment that gave your own life back to you? Turn it over gently. It begins where he began, in the grounds of a hospital for the poor in Moscow, in a family that passed its days within sight of the sick and the dying. In a wing of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, Mariinsky, in Moscow, a small boy is doing the one thing his father has forbidden. He has slipped out of the family's cramped apartment and into the hospital grounds, where the sick poor of the city sit out in the weak sun in their grey gowns, and he is talking with them, listening mostly. He is not supposed to be there at all. The doctor's children are to keep well clear of the patients and their diseases and their low company. So he goes anyway, quietly, drawn to the very people he has been told to avoid, gathering their stories the way other boys gather stones. The boy is Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this hospital is the first thing he ever knew. He was born here in 1821, in staff lodgings attached to a place whose whole purpose was the housing of the poor while they suffered and often died. Before he could read, he had learned the sound a ward makes in the night. Those faces at the fence were his first companions and his first education, and it is not too much to say that the writer who would spend his life bent over the insulted and the injured, the humiliated, the overlooked, the ones the world steps past without seeing, first met them in a garden, as a child small enough to be ignored and curious enough to stay and listen. The household behind him was a place of books and of fear in roughly equal measure. His mother, Maria, was gentle and devout and a little musical. She taught the children their letters from a book of Bible stories, and something of her warmth and her faith stayed lodged in him for the rest of his life. His father was another matter. A military surgeon who had hauled himself up from almost nothing, he was proud and anxious and suspicious of everyone. A hypochondriac who watched his own pulse and his children's faces with the same nervous attention, and given to dark moods that could fill the small rooms like smoke. The family read together in the evenings history and Pushkin and Walter Scott, and the Book of Job, which frightened and moved the boy more than anything else they owned, and the family also held its breath, waiting to see which version of the father had come home. You can learn a great deal about people in a house like that, to read a grown man's weather before he has said a word, to understand that love and dread can live in the same chest, aimed at the same person, and that this is not a contradiction, but simply the way it is. Then the warmth went out of the house. Maria, worn down by the years and by one pregnancy after another, fell ill with consumption, the slow wasting of the lungs that emptied so many homes in that century, and died in the winter of 1837 when Fyodor was 15. If you have lost someone early, you know that the grief is only the half of it. The other half is the way the whole world quietly rearranges itself around the absence, so that nothing afterwards sits quite where it used to. The father never found his footing again. He gave up his post, withdrew to a small country estate the family owned a few days south of the city, and began, by most accounts, to drink and to come apart. The two eldest boys, Fyodor and his beloved older brother, were sent far north to St. Petersburg, to a military academy that would teach them to raise fortifications and bridges. A sensible profession, chosen for them, that the younger of the two quietly hated from the first week. And it was there, in the cold and the homesickness of that first year away from everything he knew, that the news reached him. In the summer of 1839, his father was dead, found on his own land, not yet 50. How he died is a question that has never fully closed. The story that grew up around it and has been repeated for the better part of 2 centuries is a dark one. that the serfs on his estate, driven past endurance by his drunken cruelty, fell on him one afternoon in the fields and killed him, smothered him in some tellings, and arranged the scene to look like nature taking its course. It is a story with everything a story wants. It is also, almost certainly, not true. The official inquiry at the time recorded a natural death, an apoplexy, a stroke. No one was ever charged. The peasants who fell under suspicion were investigated and acquitted. The murder tale seems to have been set going by a neighbour who stood to gain the dead man's land if the serfs were convicted and marched off to Siberia. The most careful modern reading of the evidence and the original case file, maddeningly, has long since been lost, is that the doctor, who had already survived one stroke, very probably died of another, alone, on a hot afternoon, and that the rest is rumour with a motive standing behind it. Even the image we carry of the father as a monster turns out to be partly the work of the very legend we are trying to see past. But here is the strange thing, and the thing that matters more than the verdict. Whether or not a crime was ever committed in that field, the 17-year-old in St. Petersburg received in a single letter the death of his father folded inside a rumour of murder, and something in him closed around it and never opened again. The question that rumour asked became, in the fullness of time, the question of his entire life. When a man dies, and somewhere another man may have wished it, who actually carries the guilt, the hand or the wish? 4 decades later, in the last and largest thing he ever wrote, a father would be murdered, and a houseful of sons would each, in his own fashion, have wanted him gone, and the book would refuse to let the guilt settle tidily on the one who happened to hold the weapon. It was too good a knot for the next century to leave alone. Sigmund Freud, who admired Dostoevsky enormously, took up the case and pulled it tighter. In Freud's reading, the boy had secretly longed for his harsh father's death. When that buried wish appeared to come true in the most violent way imaginable, the guilt became unendurable, turned inward and surfaced as the falling sickness, the epilepsy, a punishment the son carried out upon himself, a small symbolic dying repeated again and again across the length of his life. It is an elegant theory, and a seductive one, and for a long while it coloured how people understood the man. The trouble is that almost none of it holds. The murder it leans on most likely never happened. Freud also appears to have misread the one document he relied on to fix when the seizures first began. And the epilepsy itself was almost certainly a matter of the body rather than the conscience, an organic illness, very probably inherited, of exactly the kind that would one day kill Dostoevsky's own small son. Freud, in a less guarded moment, waved his essay away as a trivial piece of work. What it really reveals is less about the boy than about the hunger of Freud's own century for a clean cause lying somewhere beneath a messy life. These are old questions to be turning over in a dark room, and the dark is exactly the right place for them, because not one of them has an answer that must arrive before morning. We cannot say, finally, how the doctor died on that summer afternoon. The people who could have told us are gone, and so is the paper. What can be said is smaller and stranger and nearer to true, that the not knowing was itself the inheritance. A boy who had grown up within arm's reach of the dying was handed, at 17, a death he could neither witness nor explain, wrapped in a rumour he could neither confirm nor set down, and he carried it north with him into the cold, into a school he did not want, in a city built on a freezing river. And somewhere in those grey rooms, instead of learning to raise bridges of stone, he began, very quietly, to do the only thing he had ever truly wished to do. You have made something you cared about, put more of yourself into it than you would readily admit to anyone, and handed it to a person whose verdict could lift you or bury you, and then you have waited. Those are strange hours. You are sure by turns that you are a fraud and that you are a genius, and beneath both certainties runs the same helpless knowledge. The thing is out of your hands now, and the world is about to tell you which of the two you are. That is roughly where Dostoevsky stood in the spring of 1845. He had finished the engineering academy 2 years earlier, and then, to the dismay of everyone who wished him well, thrown away his officer's commission and the steady salary that came with it in order to write. Full-time, on nothing, in a freezing rented room, behind on the rent, living on tea and small loans. Out of that poverty, he had made a first novel, a slim book built entirely out of letters, an aging, threadbare copying clerk and the young woman he loves and cannot rescue, two of the smallest figures in the vast machinery of the city, writing back and forth across a shared courtyard. He called it Poor Folk. A friend who shared his lodgings, himself a young writer, read the pages, could not keep still, and carried them off to a poet and publisher named Nekrasov. What happened next, Dostoevsky would tell and retell for the rest of his life, until the memory had been worn smooth by 30 years of handling, so that it reaches us now in his own enchanted version. Nekrasov and the friend sat down meaning to sample a few pages of the manuscript and found they could not stop. They read the whole of it through the night, in tears by the final letter, and then, though it was 4 o'clock in the morning, they walked straight across the sleeping city, climbed to Dostoevsky's room, and woke him to tell him what he had done. They embraced him. They told him he was a writer. And in the morning, Nekrasov carried the manuscript to the most feared literary critic in Russia, a fierce, consumptive young man named Vissarion Belinsky, and told him a new Gogol had appeared. The name wants a moment of explanation, because in Russia in 1845, it was nearly the largest thing one writer could say of another. Gogol, was the reigning genius of Russian prose, the man who had taught the whole country to look at its own clerks and swindlers and small, trampled officials and see something true and terrible in them. To call an unknown 24-year-old a new Gogol was not a compliment. It was a coronation. Belinsky, who had heard a great deal of overheated enthusiasm in his years, was unmoved. Gogols, he said dryly, spring up like mushrooms with you. Then he read the book, and it undid him. He sent for the young author and, as Dostoevsky remembered it ever after, sat him down and spoke with an intensity that frightened him slightly, telling him that he had reached by sheer instinct as an artist a truth that thinkers chase for a lifetime, that he had been handed a gift, that he must grasp its weight and stay true to it. Dostoevsky walked out of that room, he said, into the most rapturous moment of his whole life. It is the thing every young writer aches for in the dark and almost never receives, to be found all the way down by exactly the people equipped to say so. And at 24, poor and unknown at the start of the year, he had it by the end of it, completely, and was the most talked about new name in the country. What had they all seen in those letters? Gogol, for all his brilliance, had mostly shown the poor clerk from the outside, a creature of pathos and faint absurdity, a little man in a worn coat to be pitied and laughed at in the same breath. Dostoevsky took that same overlooked figure and turned him inside out. He put the pen in the clerk's own hand, let him narrate his shabby days, his helpless tenderness, his enormous fragile pride, the shame that sat on him like weather until you were no longer watching a poor man from across the courtyard, but living somewhere behind his eyes, feeling from the inside what it is to be the person the world steps past without seeing. Belinsky hailed it as the first true social novel Russia had produced, an indictment of a system that ground such people into the dirt. But the thing that was actually new in it was quieter and would outlast all the politics. Here was a writer who did not describe a soul so much as climb inside it and look out. It was, already, what he would go on doing for the rest of his life. It is worth staying a moment with the man who crowned him, because Belinsky handed Dostoevsky far more than fame. He handed him the argument of his life. Belinsky was a socialist, and by this point a furious atheist, and there was nothing cold in his unbelief. It ran on outrage. He could not stomach a God who looked down on the suffering of the poor and the innocent and let it stand, who offered the beaten and the cheated a reward in some later world in place of bread and justice in this one. To Belinsky, heaven was a tale the comfortable told the desperate to keep them quiet, and a decent man ought to refuse it on their behalf and set about building fairness here, by human hands, now. Dostoevsky was half won by it, in truth, pulled, like all of them, toward the dream of justice raised on earth. And yet the assault on Christ unsettled something in him the argument could not reach. He wrote, much later, that Belinsky reviled Christ to his face. The force of it lodged precisely because it was neither stupid nor heartless. It was compassion turned against the heavens, and some version of that case, the refusal of any paradise bought with the tears of the innocent, would rise again and again in his books, handed always to the characters he found hardest to answer. He could not have guessed, in that golden year, how quickly the ground would give way beneath him. Within weeks of Poor Folk, he published a second book, The Double, the story of a meek clerk who meets his own exact likeness in the street, a poised and charming twin who steps into his life and calmly takes it from him, crowding the original out of his own existence and into madness. Dostoevsky believed to his dying day that the idea was among the best he ever had, and he may well have been right. But the telling was murky and clotted, and ran on far too long, and the same circle that had just crowned him met it with a chill. Belinsky's praise turned cautious, then cool. And Dostoevsky, drunk on success and raw with insecurity at the same time, did himself no favours. The sudden fame had made him grand and touchy and impossible, quick to take offence, hungry for a deference no one owed him, and the sharper wits of the circle began to pass mocking little verses around at his expense. The men who had wept over his pages at dawn were laughing at him by the following winter. The breach never truly healed. Within 3 years, Belinsky was dead of consumption, the great argument between them left unfinished, and Dostoevsky was left to go on having it, with a ghost, for the next 30 years. There is a special cruelty in being lifted up and then let drop, and he felt all of it. The humiliation scalds the hotter precisely because the height was so recent. To be seen fully and then unseen turns out to be worse than never having been seen at all. It planted something in him that never entirely healed. A raw, exact knowledge of vanity and wounded pride, of the way a slighted man can sit and nurse a grievance until it sours into something darker. He would become, in time, the finest anatomist of that particular wound the world has yet produced. But that lay years ahead. For now he was a young man who had touched glory and lost his grip on it inside of 2 years, left holding a question about God he could neither accept nor put down, and a hunger for some larger thing to give himself to. That kind of argument does not get settled in a night or a year or even a life. It is the kind that can wait and go on waiting until morning. So let it wait now. What matters is that the wound and the question together left him restless and reaching, and that he began, in those unsettled evenings, to climb the stairs to a stranger's apartment on the far side of the city, where the lamps burned late and the curtains stayed drawn, and the books lying open on the table were the sort a man could be marched to Siberia for merely reading aloud. The apartment belonged to a young man named Mikhail Petrashevsky, and on Friday evenings it filled with the kind of talk that could, in the Russia of Tsar Nicholas, get every man in the room killed, though none of them quite believed that yet. They were clerks and officers and students and writers, most of them young, all of them earnest and clever, and half convinced that talking about a better world was a way of bringing it nearer. They argued about the French socialists, about a society remade along rational and humane lines, about the abolition of serfdom, about a country where a man might say what he thought and read what he wished without the censor's hand at his throat. For most of those who came, it never went further than the talk. But a smaller, secret circle had formed around a magnetic and genuinely dangerous young aristocrat, a man Dostoevsky would later call, ruefully, his own Mephistopheles, and there the conversation turned to a hidden printing press and the real machinery of a rising. Dostoevsky had drifted into that inner group. Whatever he told himself about where the line ran between talking and sedition, he had stepped across it. And yet the act the state would seize upon, when it finally came for him, was older and simpler than any conspiracy. He had read the wrong words aloud. The thing he had read more than once to those gathered rooms was a letter, Belinsky's letter, the furious, open letter the dying critic had sent to Gogol, denouncing serfdom and the lash and a church that had made itself a servant of the throne. The same Belinsky who had crowned him and then drifted from him, the same argument about justice on earth that had lodged in him and would not leave. Belinsky himself was already in his grave by then, beyond anyone's reach. Dostoevsky was not. To read those forbidden pages aloud in company was, in the eyes of a frightened government, an act of treason, and in the spring of 1849, the government came for them all. They came, as such men always seem to, before dawn. On an April night, the officers were in his room, and by morning he was inside the Peter and Paul fortress, in a stone cell of the sort built to make a man feel the world has already forgotten him. He was 27, and he would spend 8 months in that cell, alone, while a commission of inquiry picked over the meetings and the talk and the reading, and while the prisoners, held apart and told nothing, guessed at what was coming. Most of them assumed the worst they faced was exile, a term of hard labor, a few years spent somewhere cold and distant. Dostoevsky held himself together the way he always would, by working. Behind the bolted door of that cell, he wrote a quiet little story about a boy. Then, in the 3rd week of December, the prisoners were woken, dressed, and driven out through the snow to a place called Semyonovsky Square, Siemyovnovsky, where a scaffold had been raised, and troops had been drawn up in the cold, and the apparatus of an execution stood waiting for them. What happened there is the hinge on which his whole life turns, and it is worth slowing to stand inside it, because the thing that marked him in that square was not the cold, or the posts, or the rifles. It was time. He believed he had about 5 minutes left to live, and he has left us a record of what a human mind does with 5 minutes when it knows with certainty that they are the last it will ever be given. He divided them. The first portion he gave to the men beside him, turning to take his leave of the comrades he had sat and argued with on those Friday nights, and would now, it seemed, die beside. A second portion he set aside to think, one last time, about himself, to gather up the whole of his life and look at it once. And the last of it he kept simply to be alive in the world, to stand and look around for as long as looking was still his to do. Stand there with him a moment, because everyone arrives at this square in the end, though most of us are spared the rehearsal. There is a church at the edge of the square, and by his own later account, its dome had caught the low winter sun, and he found he could not stop looking at it, at the light coming off the gilded roof, at the way the rays fell across the snow. And the strangest thought took hold of him, that in 2 or 3 minutes he would somehow be part of that light, poured into it, no longer a man with a name, but a piece of the general brightness. And beneath that, sharper than any fear, rose the thought that would rule the rest of his days. What if he were not to die? What if, by some impossibility, life were handed back to him? Then each of these minutes he was now counting away would swell into an age, an eternity. He would never again waste a single one. He would make each into 100 years of living and lose nothing, nothing at all. In 28 years, he had never once grasped what a minute of being alive was worth. He grasped it now, with 3 of them left. And then the impossible thing he had just let himself imagine actually happened. The order came down the line, the men were untied from the posts, and Dostoevsky was told that he would not be shot but sent east instead in irons to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. The mercy he had not dared to reach for in those last minutes had been granted, and the strangeness of it is almost impossible to overstate, because to be certain you will die in a minute and then to be told all at once that you will not is no simple deliverance. It drags a mind back across a line it had already, at enormous cost, finished crossing. It is tempting, and it is a lie, to call this the gift that made him. The story very nearly tells itself. The young man dies and is reborn, the artist forged on the scaffold. The great valuer of life taught its worth in the only school that can teach it. Dostoevsky himself half believed that version, and the world has repeated it ever since, because it is a soothing thing to believe, that the worst that is done to us is secretly for our good. But it should be said plainly that what was done in that square was a calculated cruelty by a frightened autocrat. The death sentence and the reprieve alike settled in advance, the entire ceremony staged so that unarmed men would feel the rifle sights find them before being told they might live. The punishment ran grotesquely past anything they had done. It deserves no softening, and it did not improve everyone it touched. Some of those who stood in the snow that morning never came all the way back from it. The honest thing is to hold both halves at once and let neither cancel the other, that it was monstrous, and that he, being the particular mind he was, made out of the monstrous thing an understanding he would spend 30 years unfolding. The crime does not turn into a blessing because a genius happened to survive it. He simply did what almost no one else could have done with the wreckage. That same evening, back in his cell and still shaking with a life he had been sure he was about to lose, he wrote to his brother Mikhail, and the letter survives, and it is among the strangest things a man has ever set down hours after being marched to his own execution. There is almost no bitterness in it. Life is a gift, he wrote. Life is happiness. Every minute could have been an eternity of happiness. He told his brother he was not in despair, that, on the contrary, in changing his life, he felt himself being reborn into a new form, that life is everywhere life inside us and not in the things outside us, and that he meant to waste no more of it. A man whose own death has been cancelled at the final second is, for a short while, the most awake person alive, and you can hear that frightening wakefulness running through every line he wrote that night. It could not hold, of course. No one can live at that pitch, and the years just ahead would test the resolution far past what most people could carry. But something had been lit in him that never fully went dark. He had stood at the edge and looked over and been pulled back, and he took the knowledge of that edge into everything that came after, into the murderers and the saints and the suicides he would spend his life imagining, each of them weighed somewhere underneath, against a man counting down his last 5 minutes and learning, far too late, what a single one is worth. You are breathing right now without having to attend to it, and there is nothing remarkable in that, which is precisely the thing. It is the most ordinary fact in the world, and the whole of what he found in that square was that it is not ordinary at all. Let the breath come and go on its own. You did nothing to earn the next one, and you do not have to. It simply arrives, and then the one after it. He was driven out of the city a few days later in leg irons, across a frozen continent, toward 4 years in a place that would either break him or remake him entirely, and toward the one book they would let him keep there, which would work deeper changes in him than the scaffold had. From the moment the gates of the camp closed behind him, the men he had been thrown in among wanted nothing to do with him. To them, he was a gentleman, and a gentleman in a Siberian labor camp was a contemptible thing, soft-handed, useless, a creature of drawing rooms set down among murderers and horse thieves and deserters who had been flogged and worked to the edge of death, and who hated the gentry with a clean and uncomplicated hatred. There was no welcome in it and no mercy. For 4 years, in a crowded log barracks in the fortress town of Omsk, he would live shackled day and night among men who despised what he was, sleeping on bare planks, marching out to labor in leg irons, with no silence and no privacy and no expectation of either. The worst of it was concentrated in the bathhouse, which he set down on paper years afterward in a way that has never quite let its readers go. A low room thick with steam, so crowded that 100 shackled men were pressed flesh to flesh on the benches and the floor, the chains still on their legs, scalding water sluicing down through the filth, the din of irons and shouting and laughter battering off the walls, a heaving, half-lit chaos of branded backs and shaved heads that, when he wrote it down, reads exactly like a vision of hell, one of the lower circles a poet might have invented and no one would have believed was real. Except that it was real, and it was his life, not for an afternoon, but for years, and he had come to it straight from the make-believe death of the scaffold, as though one ending had simply handed him on to a longer one. 4 years is a long time to be hated, and a longer time still to be never for a single hour alone. Most of us could not say what a week of that would do to us, let alone 1,500 days of it. The labour in every weather, the irons, the slop, the shaved head, and over and above all of it, the total absence of solitude. No door to shut, no corner to go unwatched in, not 1 hour in 4 years that belonged to him by himself. He said later that this last thing, the impossibility of ever being alone, was among the most exquisite tortures the place had to offer, a slow erosion that worked on a man below the level of any single cruelty. He had been given, on the way east, the one thing that would carry him through it. At a transit prison in the town of Tobolsk, the convoy of condemned men was met by a small group of women, the wives of the Decembrists, aristocrats who, a quarter of a century before, had risen against the Tsar, failed, and been sent to Siberia, and whose wives had surrendered their titles and their comfortable lives to follow their husbands into exile, and had been living out there ever since, in the cold, like a handful of secular saints. These women met the new prisoners with what kindness the guards would allow, and pressed on each of them a copy of the New Testament, the only book a convict was permitted to keep in the labour camp. One of them, Natalia Fonvizina, Fon V Z No, he would remember to the end of his days. He kept that gospel beside him through the whole of his sentence, and every year after it, and in the camp, where it was very nearly the only thing he was allowed to read, he read it the way a starving man eats, slowly, over and over, until the words had worked their way into the grain of his mind. Something happened to him across those 4 years that he never fully explained, and that he came to call simply the regeneration of his convictions. He had gone into the camp a man of the 1840s, a westernizer, a reader of French socialists, persuaded that a juster world could be reasoned and organized into being from above by clever and well-meaning men. He came out believing very nearly the opposite, that the answer was not in any system imported from Paris, but in something he had found at the very bottom, among the people his old circle had theorized about for years and never once touched. The Christ of that worn New Testament had taken hold of him in a way no argument ever had, and the brutal, branded men he had recoiled from on the first day began, by slow degrees, to look different to him. Memories do not always wait to be summoned. Sometimes one surfaces on its own, for no reason you could name, and rearranges the whole of the room you are sitting in. And one surfaced in him like that on the worst night of his worst year. It was Easter in the camp, a foul and drunken holiday, the barracks loud with fighting and thick with the reek of liquor, and the sheer degraded spectacle of it had filled him with a despair so total that he had gone and lain down on his plank with his face to the wall, unable to bear the sight of the people around him for one more hour. And lying there, out of nowhere, a scene rose up in him from when he was 9 years old. He was a boy again at the family's country place, alone at the edge of a wood, and he had heard, or thought he had heard, a voice cry out that there was a wolf. Wild with terror, he had run across the open field to the nearest human being, a serf named Mare, ploughing by himself, a coarse and illiterate peasant with a dirt-blackened face. And this man, who had nothing to gain and no one watching, did not laugh at the frightened child or wave him away. He stopped his work and spoke softly, and reached out and touched the boy's cheek with one earth-stained finger, and made the sign of the cross over him, and told him gently that there was no wolf, that it was nothing, that he should go on home and not be afraid. Some 20 years later, on a filthy Easter in a Siberian prison, the grown man remembered that tenderness and understood, lying with his face to the wall, that it had lived inside an unlettered serf who expected no reward for it, and that if it had lived in Mare, it might be living still, buried and unguessed at, inside the very convicts whose drunkenness had just driven him to the wall. The people he had despised in the abstract were full of hidden Mares. After that, he wrote, he could meet the worst of them in the face. It is a beautiful story, and beautiful stories about suffering are exactly the ones to handle with the most care. There is a version of all of this that slides too easily into a lie. The lie that pain is secretly a gift, that the labor camp was a hard school sent for his improvement, that 4 years of degradation are somehow redeemed because a great writer walked out of them with his faith intact. But the same camp that supposedly handed Dostoevsky his God left other men beaten into brutes or dead in the snow, and it owed them nothing and gave them nothing. Suffering does not reliably ennoble. Far more often it simply ruins, and to forget that is to flatter a catastrophe. There is reason, too, to be wary of the holy peasant he carried out of Siberia, a figure built in good part on a single childhood memory, recovered and polished across 25 years, and formed by a man whom the actual peasants in that actual camp never accepted, and went on despising to the last day. The danger in loving the people as an idea is that it can curdle, in time, into something a great deal less lovely than Mare in his field, and yet none of that skepticism quite reaches the thing itself. Whatever its sources, the conviction he found at the bottom was real to him, and it became the ground of everything he would go on to write, the unshakable sense that no human being, however far down, is finally beyond the reach of grace. That truth is not a system, but a person, that the most degraded man in that bathhouse might be carrying somewhere beneath the filth a tenderness no theory of society had ever thought to account for. He did not arrive at this by being persuaded of it. He arrived at it by losing everything and discovering, against all expectation, that something remained. Whether that makes 4 years of misery a making or only a wound is not a question he ever entirely settled, and it is not one that has to be settled tonight. It is old and patient, and it will still be there in the morning if you find you want it. What can be said is that in 1854 the gates finally opened, and he walked out, not into freedom, but into exile and forced soldiering, a changed man from the one who had walked in, carrying a faith he could not prove and would defend for the rest of his life against every clever argument the age could throw at it. He carried out something else as well, quieter and far stranger, that had come on him somewhere in those Siberian years without warning or explanation, Now and then, without any say in the matter, his body would stiffen and fall and convulse, and give him back to himself shaken and hollowed and afraid. A thing the doctors had a cold name for, and that he would come, impossibly, to think of as the nearest he ever stood to the face of God. There is a threshold you cross every night, though you almost never catch yourself in the act of crossing it, the narrow country between being awake and being asleep, where the day's thoughts slip their moorings and begin to drift, where time stops keeping careful count, and where a stray image can rise up out of nothing and feel, for a moment, enormous and luminous and strange. You may be near it now. Most nights a person passes through in a handful of seconds and remembers none of it. But that hinge between the waking mind and the sleeping one, that quiet loosening of the ordinary world, is about the closest most of us ever come to a door that Dostoevsky, several times a month for much of his life, was flung bodily through. In the seconds before a seizure took him, he said, there would come a feeling so vast and so complete that no words he owned were equal to it. A sudden, soundless gathering of everything, as if his mind had caught fire, as if his whole being were flooded at once with light, and the scattered pieces of existence drew together into a single perfect harmony, beautiful past bearing. And he understood all at once and without effort that everything was as it should be, that all of it fit, that there was nothing left to fear or to want or to solve. It was not only joy, it was a terrible clarity as well, a sense of his own existence sharpened and multiplied many times over, as though for those few seconds he were more awake, more himself, more wholly alive than a person is ever built to be. In them, he told a friend, he finally grasped the meaning of the strange old line from the book of Revelation, that there shall be time no longer. Time simply stopped. There was a grim symmetry in it too. The same man who had once stood on a scaffold and learned to the second what a single minute of life was worth now found his own body, every few weeks, abolishing time outright and pouring something like eternity into the space of a breath. And the joy of those seconds was such that, by his own account, a man would gladly give 10 years of his life for them, perhaps the whole of it. Sit with that trade a moment, because it is not a small one. He was not speaking carelessly. He meant that a few seconds of this, call it bliss, call it harmony, call it whatever the word is that we do not quite have, would be worth more to him than a decade of ordinary days, worth more even than all the days he had left. Most of us, hearing it cold, would refuse the bargain without a second thought. And then, perhaps, we would go quiet and remember some instant of our own, a passage of music, a face turned a certain way in the light, an unremarkable evening that for no reason at all came suddenly and completely right, and wonder, honestly, what we might have paid to keep it from passing. He never set down his own seizures as case notes. He did something stranger and truer. He gave the experience away to a character. In the novel he would call the idiot, the gentle, ailing Prince Mishkin, lives through exactly these moments. The fire in the brain, the unbearable harmony, the timeless completeness. And afterward, turning them over in the cold light of health, asks the only question that really matters about them. What does it matter, Mishkin wonders, that this comes from an illness? What does it matter that the doctors call it a symptom if the thing the symptom delivers is genuine beauty, genuine harmony, a reconciliation with existence that nothing in ordinary life had ever once offered him? The highest spiritual experience of Dostoevsky's life arrived bundled inside his worst affliction, and he would lend the same lightning to more than one of the souls he invented, and he never pretended he could pull the two cleanly apart. Because there was a price, and it was savage. The light lasted only seconds, and then the body took over. The fall, the convulsion, the cry, the foam, the bitten tongue, the long minutes of absence. And then the far country of the aftermath. Hours and days when his mind came back to him dimmed and clumsy, words missing from their usual places, his memory full of holes, and over all of it a heavy, inexplicable dread, a sense of having done something terrible that he could neither name nor undo, as if the seizure left behind a residue of guilt with no crime attached to it. Those who lived closest to him left accounts of what the fits were like to witness. The sudden cry that did not sound like a human voice, the body wrenched rigid and flung down, the helpless watching, the long vigil after. He never knew when the next would come, in the street, at his desk, in front of company, in the middle of a sentence. A part of him went on being afraid of his own brain for the rest of his life. The door and the wound were the same door. Where it came from, no one can honestly say. The tidy stories about its beginning do not survive a close look. The records are thin, and the likeliest truth is that it was simply something he was born carrying, a fault written into him before he could speak. His father was said to have suffered fits, and his own small son would one day die in the grip of the same illness. It was in the blood, most probably, long before the scaffold or the camp, waiting its time. And here the hard question arrives, the one a modern mind reaches for almost at once. If the vision came out of a malfunction, abnormal electrical activity firing through one small patch of tissue, something a scanner can now very nearly find and a doctor can give a name, then was it ever a vision at all? Perhaps the harmony and the timelessness and the merging into light were only the brain misfiring, a beautiful short circuit signifying nothing. Perhaps Dostoevsky spent a lifetime mistaking a symptom for a sacrament. It is a serious objection, and it deserves to be put at full strength because a great deal of what human beings have called holy turns out, under the lamp, to have a plain physical cause. But notice what the objection quietly assumes, that to find the mechanism of an experience is to explain the experience away. It is not at all clear that this follows. Every joy you have ever felt, every grief, the rush of love, the catch of beauty in the throat, the ache of a piece of music, all of it runs on the same firing tissue. All of it could in principle be traced back to its electrical cause, and none of that tracing makes the love any less real or the music any less worth hearing. A thing can have a physical origin and still be true. The seizure can be a fact of the body and a door at the same time, and the honest position, the one Dostoevsky himself held, and the one we are finally left with, is that from inside a human life, there is simply no place to stand outside the experience and rule on it. He could never decide whether those seconds were the deepest truth he ever touched or the most beautiful lie his own flesh ever told him. And neither, it turns out, can anyone else. That is a large question to be holding, and the mercy of it is that it does not want holding tightly, not here, not now. You will feel it begin to loosen as you grow heavier, the way everything does at this hour. Let it loosen. You are nearer your own threshold than you were when this began, that soft country where the thoughts come unmoored. And there is nothing waiting on the far side of it that has to be decided tonight. He carried his strange door out of Siberia and back toward the life he had left behind, toward a city and a marriage and his desk, and into a run of years that would strip away nearly everything he had and hand him, out of the wreckage, the small and furious book that pried open the modern mind. The years that gave him back to the world also did their best to take it apart. He came home from exile, returned to his writing, and watched, inside a single black year, his life come down around him. In the spring of 1864, his wife died slowly of consumption, a woman he had married in Siberia, in a marriage that had brought neither of them much happiness, coughing her way out of the world while he sat up beside her and worked. That summer, his older brother died, the brother he had loved most of anyone, the one he had written to from the fortress on the night of the scaffold, and with him went the magazine the two of them had built, leaving Dostoevsky buried under a mountain of his brother's debts that he shouldered rather than walk away from. He was sick, bereaved, broke, and hounded by creditors. And out of that exact wreckage, written in part at the bedside of his dying wife, came one of the strangest and most far-reaching things he ever set down. A short, sour, dazzling book narrated by a man with no name, speaking to us from a hole in the ground. "I am a sick man," the man begins. "I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased." He is a retired minor official of 40, living alone in a squalid corner of St. Petersburg's that he calls his mousehole, and for 100 pages he simply talks, bitterly, restlessly, contradicting himself, half daring you to despise him, about everything he has come to understand by spending his life underground, beneath the floorboards of respectable society, watching. He is not a likable man, and he knows it. He is, in fact, the first of an entirely new kind of voice in literature, the voice of pure wounded self-consciousness, and what comes out of his mouth turns out to be among the deepest things anyone had said about human beings in a very long time. What he is arguing against is a dream that was everywhere in the Russia of his day, the bright hope of all the clever, progressive people, the idea that a human being is at bottom a reasonable creature. Show a man where his true interest lies, the thinkers of the age believed, teach him what genuinely benefits him, and naturally he will pursue it, because that is what a rational animal does. Multiply that across a whole society, and the conclusion follows like arithmetic. Arrange the world along rational lines, clear away ignorance and want, and people, seeing clearly at last, will settle themselves into a fair and contented order, a gleaming palace of glass in which everyone is happy because everyone is sensible. The most talked about Russian book of the moment had laid it all out in exactly those terms, and the man in the basement has read it, and it makes him want to put his fist through the glass. Because it is, he insists, a fantasy, and worse than a fantasy. It has the whole of the human creature exactly wrong. Reason is a fine thing, but reason is only one small part of what a person is, and it has never once governed the whole. What a man wants, more than comfort, more than safety, more even than his own happiness and advantage, is something the rational planners can find no place for in their blueprint. He wants his own will. He wants to want for himself, freely, on no one's terms but his own, and he will prove that he is free, if it comes to it, by doing the stupidest, most ruinous, most self-defeating thing imaginable, precisely because it is against his interest, precisely because no sensible person would ever choose it. Offer him a flawless, rational paradise where every need is met and every choice is made on his behalf by people who know better, and some ungovernable part of him will want to smash it to pieces simply to show that he is a man and not a key on a piano, not a stop in someone else's organ, not a cog in the great machine. Twice 2 makes 4, he allows, is an excellent thing, but twice 2 makes 4 is the beginning of death, and twice 2 makes 5 is sometimes a far more charming idea. He even claims a perverse sweetness in suffering itself. There is, he says, a genuine enjoyment to be had in a bad toothache, in lying there and groaning, not because the groaning helps, it helps nothing, but because it is one more way of announcing to the world and to himself that here is a creature who feels, a man and not a mechanism. And he knew the machine from the inside. This was a man the state had condemned to death for talking, reprieved at the final second on someone else's whim, and then worked for years in chains, a man who had been handled, quite literally, as a thing to be disposed of by people entirely certain they knew what was best for him. When he says that a human being would sooner suffer than become a smoothly running part in another man's perfect order, he is not theorizing in the abstract. You know this man, even if you would rather not. You have felt the pull he is describing on some smaller and more bearable scale, more often than you would care to admit. There is the sensible thing to do, the course laid out plain and reasonable and plainly better for you. And precisely because it is being pressed on you as the obvious choice, something in you digs in its heels and wants the opposite, wants the worst thing, the perverse thing, for no better reason than that it is yours. The man underground takes this ordinary human stubbornness and follows it all the way to the bottom. He remembers how an officer once shifted him out of the way in a tavern without so much as noticing he was there, lifting him aside like a stick of furniture, and how that small humiliation lodged in him and festered for years until at last he hatched his plan. He would walk the fashionable length of the Nevsky Prospect, Nevsky, the grand avenue where the whole city went to be seen, and he would not step aside for the officer. He would meet him shoulder to shoulder as an equal. He saved up for a respectable coat to do it in. He rehearsed it for weeks, and when he finally managed it, trembling, jostling the man's shoulder in the crowd, the officer did not even notice. The victory was total and entirely private, a triumph witnessed by no one and meaning nothing, and he treasured it for years afterward. This is freedom in the underground. Absurd, self-wounding, and absolutely defiantly his own. It would be easy, and it would be a mistake, to wave all of this away as the raving of a sick and bitter man, though that is very nearly what the rational planners would say, and their objection carries real weight, so let it be put at full strength. Is the underground man not simply ill? Is his prized freedom to choose suffering and spite anything more than a misery he has decided to take pride in? A reasonable, humane, well-built society really would feed the hungry and heal the sick and spare millions the grinding, pointless pain the world hands out for nothing. Surely that is worth more than one resentful man's right to bang his head on the wall and call the bruise his liberty. Set against the actual suffering of actual people, the freedom to be perverse can look like an obscenely expensive toy. The case for the Palace of Glass is not a stupid one. On its own terms, it is generous and humane, and Dostoevsky knew it perfectly well, which is exactly why he put the truth in the mouth of a man you would instinctively distrust. But the truth comes out anyway, and it is this: you cannot build a lasting home for a creature whose deepest need is the one thing your design has no room for. Leave freedom out of your account of a human being, and you have left out the human being. And yet, here is the turn, and it is the reason the book is far more than a clever argument. The man who has seen this truth so clearly is himself a wretch, alone in his hole, unable to love. When a young woman shows him real tenderness, the one person who looks past his bitterness and offers him something human, he drives her off with deliberate cruelty, because to take what she offers would mean climbing up out of the underground, and he no longer remembers how. His freedom is real, and it is also a cell he has locked from the inside. In one short, furious book, Dostoevsky has shown both halves of the thing he would spend the rest of his life turning over. That freedom is the deepest fact about us, the one thing no rational order can ever plan away. And that this same freedom, left entirely to itself, can damn a person as surely as it can save him. The room he wrote it in was a dark one, and the room you are lying in is dark now too, and there is an odd comfort in that, because the underground he describes is not finally a place in Petersburg at all. It is a place in a person, and most of us have been down there and found our way back. You do not have to go down tonight. Let the argument settle where it lies. But keep hold, lightly, of the door he has opened, because the man in the basement only ever bruises himself against the wall, and somewhere in the same imagination a younger and prouder figure was already taking shape, one who would decide that to prove he was truly free, truly above the common herd, he would have to raise his hand not against a wall, but against another living person. He is 23 years old, and he is climbing a dark staircase with an axe hidden under his coat. He has sewn a loop into the lining to carry it, so his hands stay free and nothing shows, and he goes up slowly, one flight at a time, his heart beating so hard he can hear it in his ears, going over the few words he means to say at the door. His name is Rodion Raskolnikov, a destitute former student in St. Petersburg, brilliant and proud and half-starved, and he is climbing these stairs to find out whether a theory he has been living inside for months is true. The theory is the thing the whole book is built to test, and it had begun, as dangerous ideas often do, as an article. Raskolnikov had written a piece about crime in which he divided the human race into two unequal kinds. Most people, he argued, are ordinary, material, obedient, born to live within the rules and keep the species going. But a rare few are extraordinary, and these few possess an inner right the rest do not. The right to step across the moral law, to break it, even to spill blood, if their purpose is large enough to require it. Think of the men the world calls great, he reasoned. The lawgivers, the conquerors, a Napoleon. Every one of them waded through blood to remake the world, and history does not condemn them. It raises them monuments. If a great man must trample a few thousand to hand humanity a new law, that trampling is not a crime, but a permission. The extraordinary man carries his sanction inside himself. There is a detail the Russian holds that the translation lets fall. The word for crime in his language means, almost literally, a stepping across, a transgression in the oldest sense. The crossing of a line one is forbidden to cross, and the name Dostoevsky gave his hero is built from a word for a split, a schism, the kind that once tore a church in two. So, before a single blow is struck, the book has already told you, in the very names, what this is going to be about. A man who crosses a line and is split in half by the crossing. Put yourself for a moment in that narrow rented room he can barely afford. You are young and clever, and you have not eaten properly in days, and you have talked yourself into believing that the one question worth answering is whether you are one of the few the rules were never meant to bind. From inside such a mind, the logic does not feel like madness at all. It feels like clarity. Here is a spiteful, miserly old pawnbroker who bleeds the desperate dry and hoards the proceeds in a locked drawer, a woman doing good to no one, while all around her young people of real promise go under for want of a few coins. Subtract her so the reasoning runs, and 100 good things become possible. One worthless life removed, and many worthy ones saved. Laid out as arithmetic, it can look almost irresistible. One small evil bought for one large good, and you can feel the pull of it, if you are honest. But the arithmetic is only a mask, and underneath it lies the colder thing that is really driving him. He does not truly care about the orphans his theory pretends to rescue. What he needs to know is which of the two kinds of human being he himself is. Is he a Napoleon, permitted everything, or is he, as he secretly fears, a louse like all the rest, a trembling creature with a right to nothing? The murder is not really a robbery. It is an experiment he intends to perform on his own soul. At the top of the stairs, the pretext gets him through the door. He has brought a pledge to pawn, a little package wrapped to look valuable. And while the old woman fumbles with the string, the axe comes down. And here the experiment goes wrong in the way experiments on the soul always go wrong. Reality refuses to stay inside the plan. The old woman's gentle, simple half-sister, Lizaveta, a meek, harmless, downtrodden creature who would not hurt a living thing, comes back to the flat at the worst possible moment, sees what he has done, and he kills her too, in a blind panic, because she is there. He had a theory to cover the first death. He had nothing at all for the second. Lizaveta was precisely the kind of defenseless, insulted, ordinary person his grand idea claimed to be serving, and he split her skull anyway, on a reflex, to save himself. Whatever the theory had promised, this is what it delivered. Not a Napoleon redrawing the map of the world, but a sick young man with blood on his hands and a second body on the floor that no philosophy will ever account for. Then comes the part the theory had not predicted at all. He is not caught. He gets clean away. The money is his. By his own logic, he should now feel the cool exhilaration of a man who has proved himself above the law. Instead, he falls to pieces. He cannot bring himself even to look at the money, let alone spend it. He buries it under a stone and leaves it there. He sinks into a fever that runs for days, raving, half out of his mind, his body in open revolt against everything his mind insists was permitted. And when the fever passes, he is not one man but two, the one who did it and still defends it, and the one who cannot live with having done it, and the two of them go to war inside him and never stop. The secret seals him off from every other person, from his own mother and the sister who adore him, so that he can be in a warm room full of people who love him and feel a sheet of glass between himself and all of them. Something he had reasoned his way past turns out to have been load-bearing after all, and without it, the whole structure of the man begins, quietly, to come down. Long afterward, he will say the truest thing said anywhere in the novel, that he did not murder the old woman, he murdered himself, that the axe, when it fell, came down on him. Now, a hard objection deserves its hearing, and the book is honest enough to raise it against itself. It is possible that none of this proves the theory wrong at all, that Raskolnikov's collapse shows only that he was never one of the extraordinary to begin with. The herd conscience reasserting itself in a man who turned out, after all, to be ordinary, while a genuinely exceptional creature, a real Napoleon, would have felt nothing and slept soundly that same night. Conscience itself, on this view, may be nothing more than conditioning, a set of inherited flinches a strong enough person could unlearn. The magistrate who slowly closes in on him, a soft-spoken, frighteningly perceptive man named Porphyry, never produces a shred of hard evidence. What he does instead is worse, because he understands the theory and the guilt beneath it better than Raskolnikov does himself, and he simply waits, tightening the silence, until the man's own divided soul drives him toward confession as the only relief left to him. But Dostoevsky has built his answer to the cold objection into the very same book, and it is not an argument. It is a person. There is another man who drifts through the edges of the story, an aging, well-bred sensualist who has actually done the thing Raskolnikov only theorized, who long ago stepped across every line there is, who is rumored to have driven the helpless to their deaths and worse, and who genuinely feels nothing whatsoever about any of it. He is the extraordinary man made real, conscience entirely shared. And what has it bought him? Not freedom, not power, not Napoleonic greatness, only a bottomless boredom, a soul gone grey and cold, a man for whom eternity itself has shrunk down to the image of a cramped and grimy bathhouse with spiders in the corners. He has crossed every line and arrived nowhere. In the end, he puts a pistol to his own head because there is simply nothing left inside him to live for. That is Dostoevsky's quiet, devastating reply to the idea that conscience is only weakness. Look hard at the man who has truly escaped it, and what you find is not a Superman, but a corpse that has not yet noticed it is dead. Your own body has been keeping a quieter account all day than your mind has, the way bodies do, holding the day's tightness, carrying what the thinking part of you set down and walked away from. You can let it put that account down now. There is nothing here in the dark for it to brace against. Let the held places in the shoulders, the jaw, the hands go soft, one at a time. Raskolnikov is still alive at the end of all this, which is its own kind of sentence, alive and sick and split and very far from free, and the strangest turn of his whole story is still in front of him. In a poor candlelit room where a girl who has sold herself to keep her family from starving is about to open an old book and read him a story about a man who was 4 days dead and walked out of the grave. The candle is burning low, and the girl is reading, and the man who killed her friend sits listening in the shadows. The room is a poor one, a corner rented in the back of someone else's flat, and the book open on her knee is a worn copy of the Gospels that the murdered woman, the gentle, simple sister cut down by the second blow of the axe, had given her not long before she died. The man is Raskolnikov, and he has come here and asked the girl to read him one passage in particular, the raising of Lazarus. She does not want to. Her hands are unsteady, and her voice keeps catching because she half senses what is in him, but he presses her, and so she reads, and when she reaches the heart of it, the man 4 days dead in the tomb, the stone rolled away, the voice that calls into the dark and tells the dead to come out, her own voice breaks like an overstrained string. Her name is Sonia, and she is, in her quiet way, the most extraordinary person in the whole book, though she would be the last on earth to think so. Her family is starving, a dying stepmother, small children, a drunkard father long past saving. And to keep them fed, she has done the one thing left to a girl with nothing to sell but herself, and walks the streets at night under the yellow ticket the police issue to women of her trade. She has been degraded about as thoroughly as a person can be, and she has come through it with her faith not merely intact but burning, holding fast to a God who, by every visible sign, has abandoned her. She is everything Raskolnikov's theory could not account for, living proof that the lowest, most trampled, most insulted creature in the city can carry a soul larger and steadier than any Napoleon's. He is drawn to her because he senses, correctly, that the two of them are a kind of pair, that she has stepped across a forbidden line just as he has. But the likeness only sharpens the difference, and the difference is the whole of it. She crossed her line to save others, and destroyed only herself in the crossing. He crossed his for himself, and destroyed others. She is what it looks like to give yourself away. He is what it looks like to take. And the story she has just read him is no accident, because Lazarus is the dead man called back into the light, and Raskolnikov is a man 4 days into his own grave who does not yet understand that he is dead. The book has held out to him, very quietly, the one thing his philosophy never could, the possibility that even he might be called out of the tomb. And then he tells her. He confesses the murder to Sonia before he confesses it to anyone with the power to punish him, and her answer is the hinge on which the whole of his redemption turns. She does not recoil, and she does not condemn. She looks at him and asks what he has done to himself. Not what he has done to them, but to himself. And in that single turn of phrase, she sees the wound beneath the crime, the self-murder folded inside the murder, more plainly than he has ever let himself see it. Then she tells him what he must do. Go to the crossroads, she says. Bow down and kiss the earth you have defiled, and say aloud to everyone that you are the one who did it. Stop running from the suffering and take it up. Carry it and let it make you new. He half manages it. He goes to the great market square in the middle of the city, sinks to his knees in the dirt, and kisses the earth, and then cannot force the words out of his mouth, because the crowd around him only laughs and decides he is drunk. If you have ever stood at the very edge of saying the one true thing aloud and felt it die in your throat, you know the exact width of the gap he could not cross. But the thing has been started, and he goes from there and gives himself up. The court sends him to Siberia, to 8 years of hard labor, and Sonia, who has no earthly reason to follow a murderer to the end of the world, sells the little she has and follows him, taking a room near the prison, present, patient, refusing to disappear. In Siberia, the change does not come quickly, and Dostoevsky, who had served his own years in a Siberian prison and knew precisely how slowly a frozen soul thaws, does not pretend otherwise. For a long time, Raskolnikov stays cold and shut and proud, sick with a regret that is only the regret of having failed, not of having done wrong. The other convicts despise him, and they love Sonia, who comes to the gates and is gentle with every one of them. Then, lying ill in the prison infirmary, he dreams a terrible dream of a plague that sweeps the world in the form of tiny creatures that lodge in the mind, so that every person infected becomes utterly certain that he alone holds the truth, until no one can agree with anyone, and humanity tears itself apart in the name of 1,000 private certainties. It is his own theory, his own pride, multiplied across the whole of mankind and shown for what it really is, not greatness, but the end of the world. He wakes from it altered. Not long after, he sees Sonia, and something that has been locked in ice for years simply gives way all at once, and he is at her feet, weeping. And the narrator reaches for the only word that fits what has happened to the two of them. They have been raised, resurrected by love. The worn gospel lies under his pillow. He has still not opened it, but he means to, and the rest, the author tells us, the long, slow story of a man's gradual rebirth, belongs to a tale he will not stop to tell. Here is Dostoevsky's reply to everything the underground had stood for, the answer he had been circling toward for years. The prison of the closed-off self, the cell that pride and reason lock from the inside, is never opened from within. No one thinks his way out of it. Thinking is the lock. It is opened only from outside, by another person who comes and stands at the door and will not leave. Not a doctrine, not a proof, not a system worked out by clever men, a face, a presence, a love that asks for nothing and cannot be argued down. Most of us know in some smaller key what it is to carry a thing we cannot say to a single soul, and what it is, once in a great while, to say it at last to one person and watch them stay. What saved the murderer was not a better idea than the one that had damned him. It was a person. It would be dishonest, though, to leave it there, glowing, because some of the most formidable readers this book has ever had do not believe a word of it, and their objection has to be heard. The fiercest was the novelist Vladimir Nabokov, who loathed this scene above all others, and said so with relish. The candle-lit tableau of the murderer and the prostitute bent together over the holy book he waved away as a cheap effect. A shoddy literary trick, he wrote, not a masterpiece of pathos. There is no genuine bridge, he insisted, between this filthy murderer and this unlucky girl, only the borrowed machinery of the sentimental novel wheeled in to make the reader weep. And he pointed, not without force, at the false arithmetic underneath the whole thing, that a girl driven to sell her body to feed dying children has done nothing remotely comparable to the act of a man who split two skulls with an axe, and that to set them side by side as fellow sinners over a guttering candle is a kind of moral fraud. The conversion at the end, on this reading, is simply unearned. A pious shortcut bolted onto 500 pages of merciless psychology, a great realist losing his nerve and reaching for the church. Sit with that, because it is not a foolish objection, and Dostoevsky himself, who struggled mightily to make the ending land, half felt the weight of it. And yet it may be aimed at the wrong place. The redemption is unearned. That is exactly the point of it. Grace, in the world Dostoevsky believed in, is unearned by its very nature. It is not a wage you collect for good behavior or a conclusion you deduce from premises. It breaks in from outside the whole chain of cause and effect the way love does, without first checking whether you deserve it, usually arriving when you least do. A redemption you could earn by argument would not be grace at all. It would only be more bookkeeping. What the murderer cannot reason his way toward, and what Nabokov's cool brilliance cannot quite reach either, is the thing the ruined girl with the broken voice already knows in her body, that a person is never finally identical to the worst thing they have done. Whether that is the deepest truth in the novel, or the precise spot where a great realist let his faith outrun his craft, is not a question that can be settled from the outside, and the book is honest enough to leave it standing open. So the resurrection, in the end, is not finished here. It is only begun, set down at its own threshold, which is the honest place to leave it. And that is a fitting thing to carry with you towards sleep, because resurrection, of all things, can afford to wait for morning. Nothing in it has to be completed tonight. The dead man takes his time coming out of the tomb. Let the question of whether the most ruined person alive can still be made new rest where it lies, unhurried, and let yourself rest alongside it, while somewhere in the same restless mind, a new and far stranger experiment is already taking shape. The question of what would happen if a writer stopped trying to redeem a murderer and instead set down, in the middle of this hard and grasping world, a man who was simply wholly good. Goodness, the real kind, unguarded, unable to calculate or protect itself, has a harder time surviving in this world than we like to think, and Dostoevsky set out in his next novel to test exactly how hard. The test began for him in front of a painting. In a museum in Switzerland, in the summer of 1867, he stood rooted before it and could not make himself move. His young wife, beside him, grew frightened. She had learned to read the particular stillness in his face, the look that sometimes came just before one of his seizures, and she took his arm and tried to draw him away. He would not be drawn. The painting that had fixed him there was of a dead body, the corpse of Christ, just taken down from the cross, laid out flat and shown with a butcher's honesty, the flesh greenish and beginning to turn, the wounds livid, the half-open eyes and mouth empty of everything, the whole figure simply, finally dead, with not the faintest hint anywhere on the canvas that this man would ever rise again. Most painters had given the world a Christ whose death was already half a triumph, lit from within by the resurrection to come. The painter of this one, a German master named Holbein, had given them only the thing itself, a tortured man, days into the grave, going the way all dead flesh goes. When at last his wife got him out of the room, Dostoevsky said a sentence she never forgot. A painting like that, he told her, could make a man lose his faith. He was, at that very moment, in the middle of writing a novel about a perfectly good man. It was, he believed, the hardest thing a writer could attempt, and he said so plainly in a letter, "There is only one positively beautiful person in all the world, and that person is Christ. To try to put another one on the page, a wholly good human being, and make him live and breathe in the modern world was very nearly impossible, and he was going to attempt it anyway." And here, in a Swiss gallery, he had come face to face with the thing that haunted the whole undertaking, goodness itself, the most beautiful man who ever lived, hanging on the wall, not glorified but annihilated, swallowed up by blind nature exactly as any of us is swallowed. The painting and the novel were two halves of one terrible question, and he carried both of them home. The good man he created is Prince Mishkin, and he arrives in Russia the way grace is supposed to arrive, from outside, unannounced, with nothing. He has spent years in a Swiss sanatorium being treated for the falling sickness and for a simplicity the world calls idiocy, and he comes back guileless, penniless, and radiantly, alarmingly honest. He cannot lie, and he cannot calculate. He sees the wound under everyone's cruelty and the child inside every scoundrel, and he says what he sees, plainly, with no armor and no agenda, expecting nothing in return. People do not know what to do with him. Some laugh at him, some are unsettled, some find themselves, almost against their will, confessing things to him they have never told a living soul, because here at last is someone who will not use it against them. You have likely met a version of him, once or twice, the person who is simply good, without calculation, who trusts too easily and judges no one. And if you are honest, you know that the sight of such a person stirs two things in you at the same time. One is the wish to protect them because the world is plainly going to eat them alive. The other, less comfortable, is the small, cold awareness of how easily you could take advantage of them yourself, if you wanted to. Dostoevsky drops his beautiful man into a society running almost entirely on that second impulse, a glittering Petersburg of money and vanity and appetite, and watches what it does to him. What it does is bound up with a woman named Nastasia Filipovna, a dark, magnificent beauty who was taken as an orphaned girl by a wealthy man, kept and used, and has grown into a creature of furious, wounded pride, certain she is ruined and defiled past saving, and bent, half the time, on her own destruction. She is being passed among men like a possession. One wants to be rid of her, another is being paid to take her off his hands. And Mishkin, seeing her face in a photograph before he has ever met her, reads the suffering under the beauty and is filled with a bottomless pity and offers, almost at once, to marry her, not out of any desire, but out of the wish to save her. Against him stands a man named Rogojin, a wild, dark-blooded merchant's son consumed by a love for her that is really a hunger, the kind of love that must own the thing it loves or destroy it. The two men, the saint and the obsessive, even exchange crosses and call each other brother, and the whole novel tightens around the woman caught between them, the man who offers her mercy, and the man who offers her a fire she half believes she deserves. In one unforgettable scene, she takes 100,000 rubles a suitor has brought to buy her, throws the whole packet into the fireplace, and dares the most money-hungry man in the room to pull it out of the flames with his bare hands, a magnificent, contemptuous gesture flung at an entire world that has priced her like livestock. There is a line from this novel that has floated free of it and become famous on its own, that beauty will save the world. It gets quoted as though it were the book's serene thesis, Mishkin's gentle creed. It is nothing of the kind. In the novel, the words are not even his. They are thrown at him, half mockingly, by a dying young man eaten up with consumption and bitterness, who challenges him with them. Is it true, Prince, that you once said beauty would save the world? And Mishkin, pressed, does not confirm it, does not explain it, says almost nothing at all. The phrase hangs in the air unanswered, a hope no one in the book can quite stand behind, while on the wall of a dark house hangs that other image, the dead Christ, beauty itself laid out as carrion. The book is not asserting that beauty saves anything. It is asking, with everything it has, whether it possibly could, and its answer, when it comes, is devastating. Goodness, set loose in this world, does not redeem it. The woman flees the saint for the fire, again and again, because she cannot bear to drag someone so pure down into her ruin, and in the end, the obsessive love kills her. Rogojin murders her with a knife, and the two men, the killer and the holy fool, keep watch together through the night beside her body. The shock of it shatters Mishkin completely. The light in him goes out. He sinks back into the speechless idiocy he came from and is carried back to the Swiss asylum, an empty ruin, his mind gone for good. The good man entered the world, and the world did not heal under his touch. It broke him, and broke nearly everyone who loved him, and closed back over the wreckage as if he had never come. So the obvious hard question is whether Mishkin's goodness was ever really goodness at all. The book itself seems to put him on trial. His innocence is not harmless, it is catastrophic. By trying to save everyone, he saves no one. By refusing to make the hard, exclusive choices that love in this world sometimes demands, he leaves a trail of ruined people behind him. There is a case to be made, and the novel keeps making it, that pure innocence, the kind that cannot calculate or protect or choose, is not a virtue at all, but a sort of negligence, a beautiful uselessness that does more damage loose in the world than ordinary compromised decency ever would. A goodness that cannot survive contact with reality and leaves corpses in its wake may be lovely to look at, like a painting, and worth nothing to live by. But turn the question over and it looks entirely different. And this is the place Dostoevsky could not get past, the place where the whole book trembles. Perhaps the catastrophe is not an indictment of the good man, but of the world that destroyed him, the same verdict the Holbein painting hands down in Paint. A world that takes a genuinely good man and grinds him to nothing has told you the truth about itself, not about him. Dostoevsky set out to write a triumphant book about goodness, and the book kept turning under his hands into a tragedy he could not prevent. He wanted Mishkin to redeem the world and found that he could not make it happen without lying, and so he did not lie. He let the good man be destroyed and left the unbearable question standing where the dead Christ stands, whether the most beautiful thing there is gets swallowed by blind nature in the end, or whether, somewhere past the edge of the canvas, past the last page, there is a resurrection that no painting and no novel can show. That is a heavy thing to hold, and you do not have to hold it now. You can feel it already beginning to come apart in your hands, the way the day's hardest thoughts do once the body starts to let go. Let it come apart. The question of whether goodness is wasted on this world is not one that closes tonight, and it does not need you awake to keep watch over it. Notice how much further off it sounds than it did a few minutes ago. And it is a strange thing, worth one last small turn of the mind as you drift, that the man who poured all of this onto the page, all this aching tenderness for the good and the ruined, was himself, in those very months, quietly coming apart in a way he could hide from no one, sitting night after night in the gilded rooms of the German spa towns, watching a little ball spin around a wheel and carry off everything he had. He did not, in the end, drown at those tables, and the reason had nothing to do with his philosophy and everything to do with another human being, the same shape of rescue he kept writing into his novels, arriving for once in his own life. She came to him a few years before the worst of it, on a cold morning in the autumn of 1866. A serious, capable young woman of 20 named Anna Snitkina, who climbed the stairs to his apartment with a notebook under her arm and her shorthand, freshly learned, hired to help a desperate man out of a corner he had backed himself into. The corner was this. A few years earlier, broke and grieving and hounded, he had signed a contract with a hard-dealing publisher who knew exactly how to exploit a man in trouble. The terms were a noose. Dostoevsky was to deliver a brand new novel by a fixed date in November of 1866, and if he failed, the publisher would gain the right to print everything Dostoevsky wrote for the next 9 years without paying him a kopeck. As the deadline bore down, he had not written a word of it. All his strength had gone into the murder novel he was already racing to finish. With a few weeks left and an impossible quantity of pages still to produce, he did the only thing he could. He hired the young stenographer and he began to dictate. Out it came, in a frantic month, a short novel about a man undone by roulette. He called it, plainly, The Gambler. And on the last possible day, with the publisher conveniently making himself impossible to find so that the deadline would simply lapse, Dostoevsky, on a lawyer's advice, carried the finished manuscript to a police officer and had it formally registered with a dated receipt hours before the trap could close. He had written himself out of the noose, and he had done it with her at the table beside him, taking down every word. Within a few months, they were married. He was 45, she was 20. There is a cruelty in the fact that the book he dictated to save himself was about a man being destroyed by gambling, because within a year, abroad and meant to be at peace, he was living that exact destruction more deeply than he ever had. He and Anna had gone to Europe partly to escape his creditors, and in the casino towns of Germany he went to pieces at the tables. The pattern never varied, and he could not break it. He would win, sometimes a great deal, and instead of leaving, he would stay until it was all gone. Then he would pawn whatever was left, his watch, his coat, and more than once Anna's wedding ring and the last of her few possessions, and write her letters drenched in self-loathing, begging her forgiveness, swearing on everything he believed that this was the end of it, that he would never touch the tables again. And then he would go back. They were so poor in those years that when their first child, a baby daughter, was born and died within 3 months, they could barely afford to bury her. Through all of it, the young woman he had married kept the household standing, forgave him each time, pawned her own things without reproach, and somehow did not break. Here is where his own life walks straight into his own philosophy, and the two of them stand staring at each other. There is a kind of thinking, and he had written its sharpest version himself, that holds that what a human being most deeply wants, more than comfort, more than sense, more even than his own good, is the freedom to do the irrational, self-ruining thing, precisely in order to prove that he is not a predictable machine. The gambler at the wheel is that idea made flesh. There is a moment at the table, with everything you own riding on a single number, when reason and self-interest fall away completely and you are pure naked will, staking it all against the odds for no reason a sensible person could ever accept. And for one held breath it feels like the most absolute freedom there is, like being, briefly, a god who answers to nothing. Dostoevsky knew that feeling from the inside, and he had built a whole vision of the human being partly out of it. But his life exposed the lie hidden inside that feeling and exposed it on his own body, where he could not look away. Because the gambler is not free. The gambler is the least free man alive. He does not stride up to the table in glorious defiance and stride away again. He is dragged back to it against his own will, weeping and swearing and going anyway, owned utterly by the thing he believed he was mastering. The shape of it is familiar even to people who have never once placed a bet. The drink, the scrolling, the wrong person, the one more of anything at all. There is the thing you swore off last night, and there you are at it again by morning, watching yourself do it from somewhere just behind your own eyes. The claim that he is choosing it freely, doing it only to prove that he can, turns out to be the precise alibi of every addict, and what it proves is the reverse of what it announces. Not a will that is free, but a will in chains, performing its own helplessness and calling the performance liberty. The deepest defender of irrational freedom the modern world had produced was himself enslaved, completely, by an irrational compulsion he despised and could not stop, and he was honest enough to know it. His great theme had turned around and put him on trial, and yet the truth was tangled, the way it always is in him, because there really was a will in it too. The staking of everything is a genuine act, not merely a symptom, and freedom and bondage were knotted together in the gambler's hand on the chips in a way that neither his philosophy nor any tidy diagnosis of addiction quite catches. What finally loosened the knot was not a better argument, and not, in the end, an act of will at all. It was the same thing that saved the murderer in his novel, a person who would not leave. In the spring of 1871, in the spa town of Wiesbaden, he lost everything one last time, and then, by his own account and hers, something broke or lifted in him, and he never gambled again, not once in the 10 years of life he had left. Anna told the story afterward as a kind of sudden deliverance, and she may well have smoothed it in the telling into something cleaner than it was. What is certain is the bare fact of it, that the compulsion of nearly a decade simply ended, and that the woman who had pawned her ring for it and forgiven it 100 times was still there when it did. She is the quiet miracle of his whole life, and it is worth saying plainly because the histories so often let her vanish into the single word, wife. Anna ran the finances, he could not. She faced down the creditors. She taught herself the publishing trade and began bringing out his books herself, and turned a man perpetually drowning in debt into a solvent one. She gave him the only stretch of stability and ordinary happiness he ever had. The man who could imagine a ruined girl following a murderer to the ends of Siberia had, in plain daylight, married a woman who did the living equivalent, who looked at the worst of him without once flinching and stayed. He spent his genius mapping the deepest places of human cruelty and bondage and grace, and he was rescued at the last, not by any of his ideas, but by the most ordinary and least theorizable thing there is, somebody's patient, stubborn, unglamorous love. Let your hands lie still for a moment, wherever they are. Notice that they are not reaching for anything, not gripping, not braced, that for now there is nothing to chase and nothing you have to keep hold of. His whole torment at those tables was a body that could not stop reaching, could not leave well enough alone, could not simply be still and have what it already had. And the thing you are free to do right now, the thing he could not do for years, is exactly nothing. Let the stillness be enough. Let the breath go long. He came home from those years free of the one thing that had owned him, steadier than he had been in a decade, ready at last to work without the wheel forever pulling at the back of his mind. And what he found waiting for him, there was a whole country he had become convinced was falling under the spell of a different kind of compulsion, not a vice this time, but an idea, one he believed was about to walk a generation of his countrymen straight off the edge of a cliff. In November of 1869, in the grounds of an agricultural academy outside Moscow, 5 young men lured a 6th into a quiet, out-of-the-way place and killed him. He was one of their own, a fellow student in their tiny revolutionary circle who had begun to argue, to doubt the leader, to look as though he might walk away. They beat him and strangled him and shot him, weighted the body and dropped it through the ice of a pond. They were not criminals of the usual kind. They thought of themselves as idealists, servants of a future paradise, and the murder was not a quarrel that got out of hand. It was a policy. Their leader had worked out that the surest way to bind the rest of them to the cause forever was to make them spill a comrade's blood together, because men who have done murder side by side can never afterward inform on one another. It worked precisely as designed. Dostoevsky read about this killing in the newspapers, and where most readers saw a sordid crime, he saw the shape of the entire coming age, and he sat down to write a novel that would be, in effect, a warning posted into the future. He gave it a title best translated as Demons, and he meant the word with care. The demons of the book are not the people, they are the ideas, and the people are merely what the ideas ride. He set at the front of it the old gospel story of a man possessed by a legion of devils, and of how the devils, once cast out, rushed into a herd of swine that promptly threw itself off a cliff and drowned, leaving the sick man sitting, healed, and in his right mind. That, Dostoevsky said, was Russia, a great body invaded by a swarm of borrowed foreign ideas, ideas that would drive the possessed straight over the edge, and his desperate hope was that the nation might somehow survive the plunge and come back to itself. The ideas in question had a creed, and it had been written down. A real revolutionary manual of the time, a catechism, its author called it, declared that the true revolutionary is a doomed man, a man with no interests of his own, no feelings, no attachments, no possessions, not even a name. A man who has cut every tie to the ordinary human world and permits himself any act whatsoever, any lie, any betrayal, any killing, in the service of the one all-justifying end. Everything is permitted to such a person, because the cause is everything, and he himself is nothing. In the novel, the man who embodies this is the cell's organizer, a tireless, grinning manipulator who is, tellingly, not even a true believer. He says outright that he is a crook, not a socialist. A man who has grasped that a total idea is the most powerful tool there is for taking power over other people, and who works the dream of universal justice like a lever to produce a chaos he can rule. And what is the dream itself when you follow it honestly to the end? One of the theorists in the book has worked the future out on paper and presents his findings almost shyly, and they are the coldest thing in it. He set out, he admits, from the principle of unlimited freedom and arrived by pure logic at unlimited despotism. His perfect society runs like this. 1/10 of humanity receives absolute liberty and absolute power, and the other 9/10 surrender their freedom entirely and live as a docile herd, watched, leveled, stripped of the higher faculties that might make them restless, equal at last in their total submission. To build a heaven of equality, it turns out, you finally have to enslave almost everyone. And somewhere in the calculations, there is the casual remark that reaching the new world will require cutting off perhaps 100 million heads. This was 1872. He was describing, with eerie precision, machinery that did not yet exist. Underneath the politics lie two deeper pits, two men who have each followed the loss of God to a private extreme. One, an engineer, has reasoned his way to a terrible conclusion. If there is no God, then the highest will in the universe is his own, and the only way to prove that will is absolutely free, to become himself a kind of God, is to kill himself for no reason at all, by pure choice, conquering the last fear there is. He means to shoot himself not in despair, but as a demonstration. The other is the dark sun the whole novel orbits, a beautiful, exhausted young aristocrat named Stavrogin, who has tried everything, good and evil alike, and felt nothing through any of it. A man so emptied out that he can commit the most monstrous acts and remain perfectly calm because there is no longer anyone home inside him to be horrified. In a chapter so dark that Dostoevsky's own editor refused to print it, Stavrogin confesses to a crime against a child and to having sat by, unmoved, while she went to her death. And the horror of the confession is not heat but cold. The bottomless cold of a man reporting his own atrocity the way another man might report the weather, still testing, even then, whether anything at all can make him feel. It is tempting to keep all of this at arm's length as the gallery of monsters in a lurid book. But the novel's real warning is that it does not begin with monsters. The young people in it do not start as killers, and that is the whole horror of it. They begin exactly where you might. You are alive in a world that is genuinely unjust, thick with suffering the comfortable look straight past, and someone offers you not a modest reform, but a total answer, a clean and final cure for all of it, and a place among the brotherhood who will bring it about. The pull of that is enormous, and it is not, at the start, the pull of cruelty. It is the pull of meaning, of belonging, of standing at last on the side of the good and the future. And then the trap closes one reasonable step at a time. If the goal is the salvation of all mankind, what is one life weighed against it? Or 1,000? Or 100 million? The arithmetic that ends in the herd and the purge begins in the heart of an idealist who has simply let one idea grow large enough to swallow every other thing, including the human being standing in front of him. Now, honesty demands that the other side be heard, because this is also, plainly, a reactionary's book. By the time he wrote it, Dostoevsky had become a deep conservative, a believer in the Tsar and the Church, and he was frankly afraid of the young radicals. His novel paints them with a loathing that spills at times into caricature, and his contemporaries on the left said so furiously, calling it a venomous slander on an idealistic generation, the panic of an aging man who had lost his nerve. There is truth in the charge. He was not a neutral observer. He was a frightened partisan, and the book is unjust to a great many decent people who wanted only to make their country less cruel. And yet, about the specific thing he had seen, the inner mechanism by which a beautiful idea, cut loose from God and from the ordinary limits of mercy, comes to license any horror at all in the name of the future, he was right, and right with a precision that took the rest of the world another 50 years and a mountain of corpses to confirm. The century that followed built, on an industrial scale, very nearly the society his shy theorist had sketched in pencil. The 10th with absolute power, the rest a watched and levelled herd. The 100 million heads no longer grim hyperbole, but a body count. Readers who lived through it recognized the book at once as a thing that had seen them coming. The honest verdict holds both halves without flinching, that it is the work of a scared reactionary settling scores with his enemies, and that the scared reactionary understood the deepest disease of the modern world better than almost anyone then alive. The room you are in is quiet, and it is worth noticing the quiet, because the demons in his book are loud. They are all noise, all certainty, all the roar of people who have found the one idea that explains everything and licenses anything. What he set against them, in the end, was something far smaller and much harder to hear. A single human face, the one thing the total idea can never account for and always tramples. Let the noise of it recede now. None of those vast and murderous certainties has any business in a dark room at this hour. But it leaves a question hanging over everything he wrote, the question that was really the engine underneath all of it. He could see, more clearly than almost anyone, what becomes of a world that has lost its God. The harder thing, the thing that tormented him to the very last, was whether he himself, past all his hope and all his fear, could actually bring himself to believe. Could he believe? The question that runs underneath everything he wrote, he had answered in his way more than 20 years before the end, in a letter so strange that it tells you almost the whole of what kind of believer he was. He had just walked out of the prison camp, and he wrote to the woman who had pressed the New Testament into his hands on the way in, and he set down a sentence no ordinary believer would ever write. If it were ever proved to him, he said, actually proved, past all argument, that Christ stood outside the truth, that the truth lay on one side and Christ on the other, then he would choose to stay with Christ and let the truth go. It is a stranger thing to say than it first sounds. He is not claiming to be certain that Christ is the truth. He is saying that if he were forced to choose between the two, he would take Christ over the truth itself, that his faith is not the conclusion of an argument, not something he has reasoned his way into and could be reasoned back out of, but a love, a loyalty, a choice of where to stand that runs deeper than proof and would survive being proven wrong. This is the opposite of the comfortable churchgoer's faith, the inherited certainty that has never once been tested. It is something harder and far less safe, a man holding on to Christ not because he has settled the question, but precisely because he never could. He said as much, plainly, near the very end of his life, in a private notebook, answering critics who assumed his religion was the easy piety of a man who had never seriously doubted. "It is not as a child," he wrote, "that I believe in Christ. My Hosanna has passed through a great furnace of doubt." The Hosanna is the old word for a cry of praise. The furnace is the doubt that the praise had to pass through and survive. It is the truest thing he ever said about his own soul. The faith was real, but it was never serene, and it was never secure. He called himself, more than once, a child of the age of doubt and disbelief, and he meant it. The corrosive, godless arguments of the modern world were not something he observed from a safe distance and then knocked down. They were things he felt in his own chest that kept him awake at night, that he could state more powerfully than the unbelievers could state them themselves. It is the reason the atheists and murderers and nihilists in his books are so unbearably convincing. He was never setting up straw men to topple. He was giving full, fair, devastating voice to the doubt that lived inside him and then trying, with everything he had, to answer it. His belief and his doubt did not take turns. They lived in him at once, at full strength, grinding against each other. And the hosanna he managed to sing came up out of that grinding, scorched and hard-won, with the heat of the furnace still on it. What he believed, when he believed, was a particular and passionate version of his country's old Orthodox Christianity. A faith centered not on doctrine, but on the living figure of Christ, on active, hands-dirty love as the only real religion, on the conviction that every single human soul, however ruined, is of infinite and equal worth, and that each of us is somehow answerable for all the rest. And it was knotted, inseparably, to his love of the Russian common people, whom he had come in the prison camp to see as the secret keepers of the true faith, a humble, suffering, God-bearing people, through whom, he was sure, Russia would one day bring the whole world back to Christ. It was a beautiful vision and a generous one, and it carried inside it, like a seed, something a good deal less beautiful. Because here we have to stop and look directly at the place where this great soul failed, and not look away from it, because it was a real failure, and it was his. The same man who preached the infinite worth of every person, who could find the image of God in a murderer and a streetwalker, was, in plain fact, an anti-Semite. It lived mostly in his journalism rather than in his novels, and it grew sharper as he aged, reaching its worst in the pages of his popular one-man magazine in 1877, where he gave over an entire essay to what he called the Jewish question. Answering Jewish readers who had written to accuse him of hatred, he denied the hatred, and then laid out at length a portrait of the Jews as a nation secretly walled off inside every other nation, bound together by an iron law of self-preservation set against the Christian world around them, and standing as the vanguard of everything he most despised about the modern age: money, materialism, the cold rule of gold over souls. He took the ugliest slur in the language and tried to dignify it by redefining it as the name for an idea, the materialist idea, the enemy of the Christian one. And then, having said all of that, he closed by declaring himself in favor of full and equal rights for Jews, because that, he wrote, is the law of Christ. It is important to be exact about what this was and was not in both directions. It was not the racial pseudoscience that would arm the horrors of the century to come. He was not imagining biology, and he was not imagining extermination, and he did, in his self-contradicting way, mean the equal rights he claimed to support. It was the older religious and economic bigotry of his time and place. The Jew as the spiritual rival of Christ-bearing Russia, the Jew as the human face of a hated modern world of finance and unbelief. But naming what it was not does nothing to soften what it was, which was real contempt for a whole people, persistent and entirely his own, set down in his own hand and read by an enormous audience. Joseph Frank, who gave the better part of a lifetime to studying him, settled on a phrase to hold it. He called him a guilty anti-Semite, a man torn, a man who could not, at some level, reconcile his own hatred with the commands of the very Christ he had staked his whole life on, and who knew it. That is the thing to carry, because it is harder and more honest than either of the easy exits. We are forever tempted with our great dead to do one of two things: to wave the ugliness away as a regrettable product of the times, or to let it cancel everything else, so that the bigot swallows the profit and we are spared the trouble of holding both at once. Dostoevsky will not let us do either. The same furnace that forged the most generous vision of the human being anyone had written also held, unextinguished, an ancient and ignoble hatred, and the two came up out of the same depths in the same man. A great soul, it turns out, is not a clean one. The very capacity that let him go further down into human darkness and human worth than almost any writer who ever lived was not separate from his own darkness. It was made of the same material, and if that is true of him, with all his genius for seeing into himself, then it stands as a quiet warning, and not only about him, because not one of us is the single, consistent, blameless thing we would like to believe we are, and the work of an honest life is partly the work of facing the contradiction we each carry and refusing to pretend that it is not there. Which is, in the end, exactly why his faith is worth taking seriously, rather than less so. It was never the faith of a man who had risen above the human muddle. It was the faith of a divided, doubting, sometimes ugly human being who chose again and again, against his own doubt and against the evidence of his own failures, to stand with Christ anyway. Hosanna through the furnace, belief held not in spite of the doubt, but right down inside it, at the highest tension a soul can carry without breaking. Let that tension go slack now. You do not have to resolve it tonight, and it will not resolve, not for him and not for you, not at this hour. The question of whether to believe, and of how a single person holds the best and the worst of themselves in the same two hands, is one of those that grows quieter, not louder, as you sink down towards sleep. You can feel it settling, losing its edges, becoming something you no longer have to answer. Let it settle. He carried that doubt and that faith and that contradiction his whole life long, and near the end he gathered up all of it. The freedom and the axe and the furnace and the failure, everything he had ever learned about what a person is, and poured the whole of it into one last enormous book, where he would put the strongest case against God ever written into the mouth of a young man he loved, and admit that he was not at all certain he could answer it. Two brothers sit in a tavern, putting off the moment they will have to part. The younger is the gentlest of the Karamazov brothers, Karamazov, a novice from the local monastery named Alyosha, Liao Shu, all faith and warmth, a young man who believes in God about as naturally as he breathes. The other is Ivan, a few years older, brilliant and cold and quietly tormented, and he has something he has to say before they go their separate ways. He has been building a case in his mind for a long time, and he wants to lay it out, just once, before the one person whose simple belief he half envies and would half like to take apart. What Ivan says over the next hour is the most powerful argument against God that has ever been set down in words, and every line of it was written by a man who spent his whole life trying to believe. Ivan begins with a careful, unsettling move. He tells his brother that he is not, in fact, going to deny that God exists. He will grant it, for the sake of the argument. What he cannot do, he says, is accept the world this God has made. His quarrel is not with the existence of the Creator, but with the creation, with the actual world, as it actually is, shot through with a kind of suffering that no explanation he has ever heard can make right. And to keep the thing honest, to stop anyone from waving it away with talk of sin and punishment and deserving, he narrows it down to the one case where all the talk of deserving falls silent. He narrows it to children. Because a grown man, Ivan says, may have eaten the apple. He may be tangled up in guilt, complicit, paying in some rough way for his own crimes. But a small child has done nothing, and Ivan has been collecting from the newspapers the things that are done to small children, and he lays a few of them quietly on the table between himself and his brother. There is a little girl, 5 years old, whose educated, respectable parents beat and degrade her for some childish fault and lock her out through a freezing night in the cold. And the child, too young even to understand what she has done wrong, kneels in the dark, beating her aching little chest and praying to dear kind God to help her, and no help comes. There is a serf boy of 8 who throws a stone in play and hurts the paw of a rich landowner's hunting dog, and the landowner has the child stripped and made to run, and looses his whole pack of hounds to chase him down, and they tear the boy to pieces in front of his own mother. Ivan does not raise his voice telling these. He does not have to, and then he asks the question the whole novel, and arguably the whole of Dostoevsky's life, was built to face. Suppose, Ivan says, that all of this is leading somewhere, that at the end of time there is a great and final harmony, a moment when every wrong is made right, when the lion lies down with the lamb, when the mother of the torn-apart boy stands up and embraces the man who set the dogs on him, and all of creation, understanding at last, cries out together that God was just after all. And suppose the suffering of the children was the necessary price of that harmony, the cost of building so beautiful a thing. Ivan's answer is no. He does not want it. He says so plainly, the harmony is not worth the tears of that one tortured child. He would rather keep his own unavenged anger, even if it should turn out that he is wrong, than buy a paradise at such a price. And so, he tells Alyosha, he is not rejecting God. He is doing something stranger and more terrible. He is, with the deepest respect, handing his entrance ticket back. He declines to come in. It is not God I do not accept, he says. It is the world he made that I cannot and will not accept. And he presses it further still. He does not even want the torturer punished, because what good does the man's damnation ever do the child who was already torn apart? Worse, he says, the mother has no right to forgive the torturer on her dead son's behalf, that suffering belongs to the child alone and stays forever unforgiven and unforgivable by anyone ever. There is no ledger in which it finally comes out even. You have very likely felt the edge of this yourself, the particular sickness that rises when the news carries some account of what was done to a child, the way the mind recoils and refuses to file it alongside the ordinary bad news of the world. Ivan has built his entire case on that refusal, and he means to make you feel it. Take the bargain he is describing and put it to yourself in those exact terms. A world of perfect and unending joy for every soul who ever lived, a harmony so complete that all the suffering of history is swallowed up and forgiven. And the single, non-negotiable price of admission is the deliberate torture of one innocent child, just one, somewhere, forever. Would you sign? Most of us, if we are honest, feel something refuse, some flat interior no that arrives before any argument and cannot be talked out of itself. And that refusal, that exact movement of the soul, is Ivan's rebellion. He is not being clever. He is being faithful to the one thing he cannot betray, which is his horror at the suffering of the innocent, and he is prepared to give up heaven itself rather than pretend that horror away. There is a second blade folded inside the first, and it is the one this whole story has been carrying from the very beginning. If there is no God, Ivan reasons, or more exactly, if there is no immortality, nothing on the far side of death to anchor anything, then there is no foundation under the moral law at all, and everything becomes permitted. It is worth being precise here, because the line has drifted in the retelling. The famous slogan that if God does not exist, everything is permitted, is a later sharpening, given its final polished form by the French philosopher Sartre most of a century afterward. What Dostoevsky actually wrote hangs not on God's bare existence, but on the soul's immortality. Take away the life beyond this one. Take away the eternal harmony Ivan has just refused, and there is no longer any reason that can be proved why a person should not do absolutely anything at all. Ivan floats the thought almost idly, turning it over like a clever idea. He has no notion yet that there is a man under the same roof who is listening, and who will take it not as an idea, but as a permission and act on it. Stay a moment with the sheer strangeness of who wrote this. It would be one thing for a settled atheist to mount this assault on faith. But Dostoevsky was no such thing. He was the man from the furnace, the believer who had chosen Christ over the truth itself. And he built this argument, the children and the ticket and the permission, with more force and more art than any unbeliever ever managed, and aimed the whole of it squarely at the God on whom he had staked his own soul. He did not stack the deck. He gave the case against everything he loved its strongest possible form, and then he confessed in his private letters that he was afraid he might not be able to answer it. That is not the work of a propagandist. It is the work of a man so honest that he would rather lose the argument fairly than win it by cheating. A man putting his own faith on trial, in the open, with the prosecution handed every advantage. It is far too large a question to settle here in the dark, and the mercy of the hour is that it does not ask to be settled now. Ivan's no has waited 150 years for an answer, and it can wait until morning for yours. Let it rest there, unanswered, where it has always rested. But the brothers are not finished in that tavern. Ivan has more to say. He has been carrying something in his head, a strange poem he never wrote down, about a day long ago, when the one figure who might have answered all of this came quietly back to earth and was arrested for it. It is 16th century Spain, in the worst years of the Inquisition, when the church is burning heretics in the public squares by the hundred. And on the day after one such burning, in the city of Seville, Christ comes back. Not at the end of the world, in glory, the way he had promised, but quietly, in his old human form, walking the same streets where the smoke from yesterday's fire has barely cleared. And the people know him at once. They are drawn to him. They weep. They kiss the ground where his feet have passed. He heals a blind old man with a touch, and when a small white coffin is carried past, he stops it and raises the dead child inside. And the old cardinal who runs the Inquisition, who had presided over the burning the day before, watches all of this from across the square and orders his guards to arrest the man working the miracles. And the crowd, so cowed, so trained to obedience, parts and lets it happen. That night, the old man comes down to the dungeon alone, carrying a light, stands in front of his prisoner and begins to talk. For the length of the speech you are shut in that cell with the two of them. The single candle, the old voice going on and on through the dark, the prisoner who will not say one word. Christ says nothing. He says nothing the entire time. The whole chapter is a single voice in a cell, the most powerful monologue Dostoevsky ever wrote, and his prisoner never once answers back. "Why have you come back?" the Inquisitor asks. "To get in our way? We do not need you anymore. Tomorrow I am going to burn you as the worst of the heretics. And the very people who kissed your feet in the square today will rush to rake the coals around your stake, and they will be right to, because we have finally given them what you would not." And then he tells Christ exactly what his crime was, and the crime was freedom. Long ago, in the wilderness, the Inquisitor reminds him, "The devil offered you 3 things, and you refused all 3, and in refusing them, you laid an impossible burden on the whole human race. You were offered bread, the power to turn stones into bread and feed the hungry forever, and you refused it because you wanted people to follow you freely, out of love, and not for the loaf in their hands. But people are weak," the old man says, "and in the end, they will always lay their freedom down at the feet of whoever feeds them. Feed them first, and only then ask them to be good. You were offered the miracle, to throw yourself down and be caught by angels, to compel belief with a wonder no one could deny, and you refused it because you wanted faith freely given, not faith forced by a spectacle. But people cannot bear a faith with no miracle in it. They crave the wonder. They need to be awed. And you were offered the kingdoms of the world, the sword of the emperor, the authority to rule and unite all of mankind under a single roof. And you refused that too, because you would not buy obedience with power. And so the Inquisitor says, "We took the sword you threw away. We took all of it. There are only 3 powers," he tells the silent figure, "that can conquer and hold the conscience of these weak, rebellious creatures forever and give them peace. Only 3: miracle, mystery, and authority. The wonder that overawes them, the holy secret they can bow to without ever having to understand it, and the firm hand that tells them once and for all what to do and what to believe, so they never again have to decide for themselves. You rejected all 3 in the name of freedom. We have taken up all 3 in the name of mercy. We have corrected your work. We have lifted from millions upon millions the unbearable weight you tried to make them carry, the weight of choosing, alone, between good and evil, with nothing to lean on. And in exchange for that freedom, which was crushing them, we have given them what they actually wanted: bread and certainty and someone to bow down to, and the quiet of being led like children. Nothing," he says, "has ever been more insupportable to a man or to a whole society of men than freedom." And here is the turn that makes the speech almost unanswerable, the thing that lifts it clean out of mere villainy. The old man is not a cynic, and he is not lying. He insists, and the text gives us no reason to doubt him, that he does all of this out of love. He pities humanity. He has looked clear-eyed at what most people actually are: frightened, weak, desperate above all else to find someone they can hand their freedom to, and he has chosen to be the one who takes it from them and carries it himself, so they can be happy. He knows the cost. He knows that he and the few like him have damned themselves to do it, that they secretly serve the dark spirit of the wilderness and not the Christ they preach, that they have taken the lie and the curse onto their own shoulders so the masses can sleep at night. His tyranny is, in his own telling, the most terrible act of compassion ever performed. He loves mankind too much to leave them free. Do not be too quick to set yourself against him, because he is also describing you in your weaker hours. You have felt the weight he is talking about, the exhaustion of having to decide over and over with no certainty what is true and what is right and how to live. And you have felt, somewhere underneath, the very longing he is counting on, the wish that someone would simply take all of it off your hands and tell you, with total authority, exactly what to think and do so that you could finally stop. Every age finds new versions of the Inquisitor's bargain on offer. The movement, the leader, the system, the certainty that asks for nothing but your freedom in return for the end of all doubt. And the reason the offer never stops working is that he was right about the weight. Freedom is heavy. Carrying it is lonely and frightening, and there is always someone gentle and certain standing nearby, ready to carry it for you. So how does Christ answer the most devastating case against him ever made? He does not. He has not said a word the whole night, and he does not begin now. The old man finishes and falls silent, and waits, longing, the text says, for his prisoner to say something, anything, even something bitter and terrible. And instead, the prisoner rises and crosses the cell and kisses the old man softly on his bloodless 90-year-old lips. That is the entire answer. The Inquisitor shudders. Something moves at the corner of his mouth. The kiss goes on, glowing in his heart. And still, he does not change his mind. He goes to the door, opens it, and says, "Go and do not come back. Come no more, never, never." And he lets his prisoner out into the dark streets of the city, and the figure goes. Now, you should know that Dostoevsky built this on purpose to terrify himself, and it has terrified careful readers ever since, because on the level of pure argument, the Inquisitor seems to win. The kiss is not a refutation. It answers none of the old man's points. It concedes every last one of them about human weakness, and goes on loving anyway. Dostoevsky knew the danger of what he had made. He wrote in his letters that he had given the case against faith and freedom the strongest form he could possibly find, and worried, openly, that the answer he meant to set against it would not be powerful enough to stand. He was aiming in part at a target of his own, at the Roman Church and at the socialism he saw as its godless heir, both of which he accused of striking exactly the Inquisitor's bargain, seizing earthly power to make men happy by taking their freedom away. But the argument he built is far larger than his quarrel, and it cuts in every direction, including straight back at his own loyalties. It indicts any authority of any kind that offers to relieve human beings of the burden of being free. Perhaps that is the whole point of the kiss, that the only possible answer to the case for taking freedom away is not a better argument, but love itself, freely given, expecting nothing. The one thing the Inquisitor's perfect, happy, unfree world can never produce. But Dostoevsky does not tell us we are right to think so. He lets the old man keep his idea and lets the kiss glow against it in the dark, and leaves the two of them there, unreconciled, for us to sit between. It is a great deal to be holding in a dark room, this question of whether you would trade your freedom for peace, and whether love can answer an argument it cannot refute. Set it down for now. It is far too heavy to carry into sleep, and it is not asking to be carried. The room around you is quiet, and you are free at this hour of every demand the daylight makes, free even of the need to decide anything at all, which is the one freedom the old Inquisitor would have approved of. Let that freedom be a soft one tonight. But the poem does not stay safely inside the tavern where Ivan recites it. An idea with that much force never does. It slips out into the world and goes looking for a hand to do its work. And in the same house that very night, there is a man who has been listening to Ivan for a long time and who has quietly concluded that if everything is permitted, then there is a thing that may as well be done. The thing gets done. While Ivan was up in the clouds building his beautiful, terrible arguments, a man under the same roof had been listening to every word. The family's half-brother and servant, a cold, clever, resentful man named Smerdyakov, and he had drawn the conclusion that Ivan was too refined to draw out loud. If there is no God and everything is permitted, then there is no reason on earth not to murder the drunken, cruel old father whom nearly everyone in that house, in some buried corner of themselves, wishes dead. So one night he kills him, and then, in a quiet room, he tells Ivan what he has done and lays the whole of it at Ivan's feet. "You are the real murderer," Smerdyakov tells him, almost gently. "I was only your instrument, your servant, doing what you taught me. You were the one who said that everything is permitted, that there is no virtue if there is no immortality. I simply believed you and acted on it, and now look how frightened you are." And Ivan, who had handled the idea as a brilliant abstraction, a thing to be turned over in a tavern and admired, discovers that it has hands, and that those hands have killed his father. The idea has become a corpse. The clever argument he floated to win a conversation has walked downstairs and committed a murder, and there is no taking it back. It destroys him. Smerdyakov hangs himself, taking the proof with him, so that Ivan cannot even undo the second injustice. The wrong brother, the passionate eldest, who had wanted the father dead but never once touched him, is tried and convicted of the killing on the weight of the evidence, while the man with the real blood on his hands swings from a nail. And Ivan, sliding into a brain fever, is visited in his room by the devil. Not a creature of horns and fire, but a shabby, sponging, second-rate gentleman in a worn coat, who settles into the corner and makes pleasant conversation, and who is, of course, nothing but Ivan's own mind turned against him, his own glittering ideas handed back to him, cheapened and ridiculous. Everything is permitted, reduced to the patter of a tedious houseguest he cannot make leave. The proud, cold intellect that built the case against God comes apart in that room, throwing a glass at a hallucination, insisting it is not real, knowing that it is and is not real at the same time. The man who armed the murder turns out to be the murder's last victim. This is the first half of Dostoevsky's answer to Ivan, and it is a hard one. An idea is never innocent of what is done in its name. The thought you float so cleverly, so freely, as if thinking cost nothing, goes out of you and into the world and finds a hand, and the hand is rarely as refined as the head that supplied it. Ideas have consequences, and the consequences come for everyone, including the one who first had the idea. But notice what this is not. It is not a refutation of anything Ivan said in that tavern. It does not answer the children or the ticket or the Inquisitor. It only shows what the idea costs. And Dostoevsky knew that showing the cost was not the same as winning the argument, so for the real answer, he reached past argument altogether. He reached for a life. The whole vast book is built like a kind of scale, and on the pan opposite Ivan, he set an old monk, the elder Zosima, and Zosima does not argue with Ivan at all. He never takes up a single one of Ivan's points. Instead, he offers a way of living, which is a different kind of thing from a proof and maybe a deeper one. Its center is what he calls active love, and he sets it against what he calls love in dreams. Love in dreams, he says, is the love that wants the grand gesture to save all of humanity heroically at once with everyone watching. And it is easy, and it is mostly about the one doing the feeling. Active love is the opposite. Slow, unglamorous, often thankless, the daily labor of being patient and kind with the actual irritating, ungrateful people directly in front of you. Love in dreams, he says, is greedy for immediate action. Active love is labor and fortitude. He speaks of a man who confessed that the more he loved humanity in general, the less he could love any particular person. And that is the whole trap laid bare. The warm, cheap glow of loving everyone, which costs nothing at all, set against the hard daily work of loving someone, which costs everything you have. You know the difference if you are honest with yourself because you live inside it. It is effortless to feel a great, tender love for humanity in the abstract, for the poor, for the suffering, for people in general, and it is genuinely hard, some days nearly impossible, to be patient and gentle with the difficult person across the table, the one who is real, who repeats themselves, who is ungrateful, who is here. Zosima's entire answer to the magnificent darkness of Ivan is folded into that homely distinction, joined to one more conviction. He says he learned from a brother who died as a boy, radiant and forgiving on his deathbed, that every one of us is responsible to all the others, for everything, not in the abstract, but personally, each of us answerable for all the rest. It is the exact reverse of Ivan's lonely refusal and the Inquisitor's obedient herd. Not a few carrying the burden for the many, but every single person carrying it for every other. And the book does not end on the argument. It ends on a small picture of precisely this. After all of it, the murder, the trial, the broken brother, the devil in the corner, the last scene is Alyosha standing with a group of schoolboys beside a stone at the grave of a child they have all loved and lost, and he does not give them a theology. He tells them to remember this, to hold on to this one good moment, because there is nothing in all of life so strong and so saving as a single good memory, especially one from childhood. That a person who carries even one such memory in his heart may yet be rescued by it on some far worse day, years from now. Be kind to one another, he tells them, in so many words. Do not forget each other. Remember that we were good here once. And the boys, moved past themselves, cry out his name, hurrah for Karamazov, and on that, on a man and some children and a promise to remember, the greatest of all his novels simply ends. Whether that is an answer to Ivan is the question Dostoevsky leaves unresolved on purpose, because he was too honest to pretend it was settled. Set the two pans of the scale against each other and you feel the trouble at once. Ivan's case is airtight. It explains nothing away and asks nothing be explained away. It simply stands. And against it, Dostoevsky offers what? A monk's homely talk about patience and kindness, and some boys crying by a stone. Not a counter-argument, not a proof that the children's suffering is justified after all. Nothing on the level of logic that so much as touches Ivan's case. And Dostoevsky knew it. He confessed in his letters that he was afraid his elder was not strong enough to stand against his rebel, that the case for God he had spent the book building might be quietly losing to the case against it that he had built better. He let the scales tremble and did not force them down. His whole life's wager, never proven, only chosen, was that a life of active love says something no argument can reach or refute, that the answer to the unanswerable is not to answer it at all, but to go on loving anyway, here, in the particular, with the difficult person in front of you. He could not prove it. He staked everything on it regardless. Notice, as all of this settles, that everything he points to lives in the body and not the head. The murder was an idea, the devil was an idea, Ivan's whole ruin came down through the mind. But active love is hands, a meal carried to a sick neighbor, a child's hair smoothed back from its face, a difficult person sat with one more time. It is done with the body, slowly, in the dark, where you are right now. Your own body is quiet and warm and asking nothing of you tonight. Let it be the simple, wordless argument that it is, the one that does not need to win. He set down the last page of that enormous book, the whole of his soul poured into it, the rebellion and the kiss and the stone. Late in 1880, an old, ill, finally peaceful man who had said, at last, everything he had to say. And he would be dead within a few months. In the last full summer of his life, in 1880, the country that had imprisoned him and half forgotten him and only grudgingly read him, gave him, for one extraordinary afternoon, everything. It happened in Moscow, at a ceremony to unveil a statue of the poet Pushkin. Pushkin, the writer Russians love the way other nations love their scriptures. Dostoevsky was asked to speak, and he stood up before a hall packed with the whole quarrelling mind of the country. The Westernizers who wanted Russia to become Europe, the Slavophiles who wanted it to stay itself, men who had been at each other's throats for decades. And he gave a speech about Pushkin that became something else entirely, a speech about what Russia was for. Not to conquer, he said, but to reconcile, to become the brother of all peoples, to take the whole of suffering humanity into itself and make it whole. And the hall came apart. People wept openly. Strangers who had been enemies an hour before embraced in the aisles. A young man fainted. Some in the crowd surged toward the stage. Others called out the word "prophet, prophet," at the old, sick, grey-bearded man standing there blinking at what he had done. For one afternoon, the man who had stood on a scaffold expecting to be shot, who had worn chains in Siberia, who had buried his own children and gambled away his wife's wedding ring, and written his greatest books one desperate step ahead of his creditors, was lifted up by his whole nation as its conscience and its seer. It did not last, and he would not have been himself if he had pretended it could. Within days, the old quarrels closed back over the moment. The rival he had moved to tears in that hall was, by the end of the week, privately calling the speech brilliant nonsense built on a false foundation. The reconciliation Dostoevsky longed for between the halves of his country and between the halves of every single human being was real for an afternoon, and then it was gone, the way such things are. But he had felt it once, the thing he had spent his whole life writing toward. A roomful of divided people made one, for an hour, by something spoken aloud. It was as close as the world ever let him come. He had about 8 months left. That winter his lungs, which had never been strong, began to fail him in earnest. There was a hemorrhage and then another, the blood coming up from somewhere deep, and over 2 or 3 days at the end of January it became clear to him and to everyone around him that he was dying. His wife Anna was beside him, as she had been beside him through all of it. And at some point in those last hours he asked her to bring him a particular book, the worn copy of the New Testament that the wives of the exiled prisoners had pressed into his hands at Tobolsk 30 years before, the only book he had been allowed in the prison camp, the book he had read until it was part of the grain of his mind. He asked her to open it at random and read whatever her eye fell on, the way a person might put a question to the book. It opened to the Gospel of Matthew, to the words Jesus speaks at the river, at his baptism, when John tries to hold him back. "Do not hold me back, let it be so now." And he said to her quietly that this was the sign, that it meant he would die today. He was right. He died that evening, with the book near him and Anna's hand in his, an old man of 59 who had packed 9 lifetimes into the one. The city came out for him. Tens of thousands of people, students and workers and aristocrats, and the kind of poor he had spent his whole life insisting carried souls as deep as anyone's, followed the coffin through the streets in a procession miles long, more than had ever come out for a writer, more than would come out for almost anyone. They buried him in a cemetery among the poets, and on the stone they carved a line he had loved, the same line he had set at the very front of his last great book, that unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. A seed has to be buried, has to seem to come to nothing, before anything can grow from it. He had chosen those words for himself a long time before he needed them. Now what, in the end, did he leave unfinished? This man who is offered to you tonight as having thought everything through, all the way to the bottom. He left the one thing he could never finish, the question he had carried out of that snowy square as a young man and held unanswered all the way to that bed, whether, in a world that may have no God above it and no life beyond this one, anything at all holds a human being back. Whether everything is permitted or whether something, love, perhaps only love, quietly forbids it after all. He never settled it, and that is the thing to understand about him, and it is the opposite of a weakness. He did not believe the way a child believes, easily, having never doubted. He believed the way a man believes who has built the case against his own faith with his own hands, more powerfully than any enemy ever could, and felt the full crushing weight of it, and chosen anyway, in the teeth of it, to stand with love and not with the void. His hosanna passed through the furnace and came out scorched and certain of nothing and singing all the same. He held the question and the faith together, both at full strength, both to the last breath, and that holding, that flat refusal either to lie about the doubt or to surrender to it, was not his failure to find the answer. It was the answer, the only honest one a person can give, not a proof, but a whole life spent choosing, in the dark, without any certainty at all, what to love and what to do. He could not have known how far the questions would travel after him. A few years after he died, a lonely, half-blind philosopher in a foreign town stumbled on one of his books by chance in a shop and felt the shock of meeting a brother, and called Dostoevsky the only psychologist he had ever learned anything from, though he died before he could read the last and deepest of the novels, the one with the children and the ticket and the kiss. The doctor who would go on to map the unconscious mind called that same book the most magnificent ever written. A whole school of thinkers who came after took his terrible questions, the freedom, the absurd, the everything is permitted, and carried them out into the new century, very often keeping the rebellion he had voiced so well and quietly, leaving behind the Christ he had bled for. And that new century built, in steel and barbed wire and mass graves, almost exactly the nightmare he had sketched out in advance, the world of men possessed by an idea, until people who had survived it picked up his books and shuddered at how completely he had seen them coming. He had wanted, more than almost anything, to be a prophet, and he was one, though not in the gentle way he had hoped. He saw the disease far more clearly than the world believed, far more clearly than he ever managed to see the cure. But all of that is the daylight world, the world of arguments and influence and the long quarrels of the living, and it is not where any of this leaves you tonight. Because the question is yours now, it was always going to be handed to you, sooner or later. That is what these questions do. They pass from one person lying awake in the dark to the next, and this one has come a very long way to reach you, from a boy at a hospital fence among the dying, through a single minute on a scaffold, through 4 years of chains and a lifetime of seizures and one small ball spinning around a wheel, through a man with an axe and a man in a basement and a brother handing back his ticket and an old inquisitor alone in a cell. All of it carrying the same plain, enormous question down to where you are lying right now. If there is nothing at all holding the world up, are you free to do anything you like? Or is there something after everything that holds, not a rule and not a proof, but the face of another person, the unbearable weight of a single child's tear, the stubborn, unprovable pull of a love that no argument has ever quite explained away? You do not have to answer it. That is the gift of this hour, and it may be the truest thing this whole long night has to give you. He could not answer it, with all his genius, across an entire lifetime of trying, and you are under no obligation whatsoever to do tonight what he could not do in 59 years. The question can simply be set down now, here, in the dark, the way you would set down anything too heavy to carry into sleep. It will keep. It has kept for 150 years already. It will keep until morning and far longer than that. So let it go now, gently, the way the day itself is already going. You have come a long way tonight, all the way through one enormous, divided, luminous human soul, from a hospital fence to a scaffold to a prison to a deathbed, and there is nothing left for you to do with any of it but rest. The thinking is finished. Whatever the day asked of you, it is behind you now, and it does not need you tonight. It will still be there in the morning, and so will you. Feel how the bed holds you up. Notice how little it asks of you. Only that you do nothing, that you let yourself be held, your whole weight given over to it, nothing left to carry. And feel the breath which you do not have to manage, and never did. It has been moving on its own since long before you can remember, drawing in and letting go, drawing in and letting go, the smallest and most faithful thing you own. He learned, in one unbearable minute on that scaffold long ago, that a single breath of being alive is worth more than anyone can ever say. You do not have to learn it the hard way, the way he did. You can simply have it, this breath, and then the next one, freely, asking nothing, owing nothing, each one arriving on its own to keep you while you do nothing at all but receive it. The room around you has not changed. It is the same dark, quiet room it was when all of this began, only softer now and further away. The great questions are still somewhere in it, but they have drifted off to the edges where they belong at this hour, murmuring quietly among themselves, content at last to let you be. There is nowhere you need to go. There is nothing you need to decide. Everything that felt so urgent in the daylight has loosened its grip and stepped back into the shadows, and the dark, you may begin to notice, is not empty and is not against you. It is holding you, the way it held him at the very end, the way it has held everyone who ever lay down in it and let go. The man whose whole long life we have followed tonight is at rest now, and has been for a very long time. The doubt and the faith finally laid down side by side, the question set gently in the ground beneath the grain of wheat, quiet and finished and at peace. He carried it as far as any person can carry anything, and then he set it down. And you can set yours down too now, just for tonight. It is not going anywhere, and neither are you, and there is all the time in the world. So let the shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding the day. Let the jaw soften, and the hands and the long muscles of the back. Let the thoughts come loose and begin to drift, untethered, the way they do right at the edge of sleep, where one of them turns, without your ever noticing the moment, into the beginning of a dream. There is nothing left to hold on to, and nothing left to keep watch over. The night is long, and it is kind, and it is yours. Rest now, sleep well, good night.